Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Reihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and welcome to Unleashing Prosperity toward a new conservative economic agenda. To those of you who are new to the Manhattan Institute, we are an organization that works to keep America and its great cities prosperous, safe, and free. Our scholars have been at the forefront of efforts to restore public safety in our nation's urban centers and defend colorblind equality before the law. Yet political economy has always been at the heart of our mission, which is why we're gathered here today. MI was first established in the late 1970s, a time when inflation was rampant, young people were anxious about their economic future, and there was a pervasive sense that America was on the cusp of economic decline. Soon after its inception, the Institute emerged as the nerve center of the supply-side movement, which aimed to improve incentives to work and invest and, in doing so, to unleash the entrepreneurial energies of the American people. That approach undergirded the economic revival of the 1980s and 1990s. But we now find ourselves in a moment that eerily resembles the late 1970s. Inflation is back, sapping the purchasing power of the American working class. Younger Americans are priced out of homes, and they fear that they'll never be able to afford families of their own. And the nation's most innovative industries are again being hamstrung by regulations that inflate costs and shield incumbents from competition. Though America remains the world's most prosperous economy of any significant size, our growth rate is now dismally low. Between 1950 and 2000, real GDP per capita grew at an average annual rate of 2.25%. Since 2000, it has grown at roughly 1%. Had the GDP per capita continued to grow at that earlier rate, we'd now be more than 25% richer. Every challenge we face, from an increasingly aggressive Chinese empire to meeting the needs of a rapidly aging population, would be easier to solve with higher growth. We can do better, and we must do better. The question is how. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the elite consensus has favored demand-side policies that boost growth through unprecedented monetary and fiscal stimulus. The result has been a disastrous combination of runaway asset inflation, wasteful public spending, and stagnant productivity. At the Manhattan Institute, we believe that the time has come for a new supply-side agenda, one that chooses abundance over scarcity, wealth creation over wealth redistribution, and the work ethic over welfare dependence. And with that, let's begin our program. Over to you, Matt.
Well, thank you, Reihan, and thank you to the Manhattan Institute for assembling this conference that's very important and necessary in today's political economy. And it's also fitting, I think, that we're meeting here in the Ronald Reagan building to discuss the next supply-side agenda. On January 5th, 1967, Ronald Reagan delivered his first inaugural address as governor of California. And to read his speech is to be reminded that some problems recur throughout history and that lessons of a previous era often apply to our own. The first topic Reagan mentioned was crime. He discussed welfare reform and education. He brought up radicalism on the campus. He called for lower taxes and for fiscal discipline. But what strikes a contemporary reader of Reagan's speech is the rhetorical framework he used. All these individual issues, he said, were aspects of a general relationship between government and the people. And as today's Republicans and conservatives grapple with inflation, crime, illegal immigration, and a culture of repudiation, they might take note of how the most popular and successful GOP president of the last century thought about the social contract. For Reagan, the American government was not omnipotent. The founders did not mean for government to be fickle or arbitrary. They did not intend for it to lord over its subjects. They wanted the law to reflect the consensus of self-governed citizens. Rather than build a great society engineered by politicians and bureaucrats in Sacramento, California, or in Washington, D.C., Reagan evoked a creative society where government will lead but not rule, listen but not lecture. Now, it's interesting to look back because very shortly after he was inaugurated governor, Reagan dropped the creative society moniker. Yet many of the principles that he enunciated in that speech and, of course, throughout his public career were reflected in additional public addresses, including one of his most famous, his inaugural address as president in January 20th, 1981. In that speech, he cautioned voters and tried to allay anyone who was anxious about his association with libertarianism by saying, "It's not my intention to do away with government. It is rather to make it work with us, not over us, to stand by our side, not ride on our back. Government, Reagan said, can and must provide opportunity, not smother it, foster productivity, not stifle it. The creative society was living on, even if not by that name. And I think the Reagan agenda that he brought to Washington in 1981 was a reflection of the Great Society. Reagan had been influenced in 1980 and had adopted the program of a small group of policy intellectuals, of journalists, of think tank scholars, known as the supply-side movement. And I think he came to adopt supply-side economics, which viewed incentives as the key to increasing productivity, prioritizing investment, and producing economic growth, as reflective of this generalist view he had of the social contract. And so as we begin this discussion today, we might want to think about how that view of the creative society and the role of government in it is compatible with a supply-side economic policy that removes the obstacles that stand in the way of human flourishing, rather than redistributing resources and honors between groups. So I'm honored to begin this discussion, to kick it off with two people who are filled to the brim with insights on this subject. On the far right, or my far right, is Judge Glock, the Director of Research and Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And in between Judge and I is Eli Dorado, the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. And we'll spend about the next half hour or so, 35 minutes or so, talking about what a new supply-side agenda might look like, and then, of course, open it up to questions and get the discussion going with the audience as well. So, Judge, maybe I'll start with you. In that little historical précis, I mentioned Reagan's association with the supply-side movement and the supply-side economics movement of the 1970s, building off the academic work of Nobel laureate Robert Mundell, kind of some of the insights of the business school professor Art Laffer, popularized through the Wall Street Journal and in magazines like The Public Interest, kind of worked out. And yet you look up today and you see the people who are most interested in the label supply side are not on the right. They're progressives. They're members of the progressive left. And whether it's speeches by Treasury Secretary Yellen or by the former head of the National Economic Council, Brian Deese, or by our New York Times columnist Ezra Klein, it's progressives who are taking up the supply side label. And so I guess I'll just start by asking you, Judge, why, and why are they wrong?
Thank you, Matt. They're partially right and they're partially wrong. And I think the reason why they're both those things comes a little bit from some of that history you alluded to. Now, why has it become very popular among the left recently? Partially, I think we all have to attribute this just to the inevitable nature of intellectual fads. If you look at, I was talking to someone who was in law school, say in the 70s and 80s, and they were doing law and economics, and say, oh, well, they would write an article about, well, supply and demand determines the price of these goods in the market. And, oh, that's a Harvard Law Review right there. They just took a simple, obvious explanation from another sphere in another department and plopped it into a department that it wasn't aware of it yet. And so when you read some of these discussions and articles on the left, I'm always very surprised, and to many of us who've been saying some of these things for years or decades, it's somewhat surprising. They say, well, write this article as well. Did you know that regulation often prevents people from accomplishing what they want to accomplish? And, well, of course, this isn't the first time these things have been articulated, but it is very exciting and new for a lot of people who weren't aware of this. This is something that's very enticing to them. But if you look a little bit more in the weeds, I think it doesn't mimic the classical Robert Mundell, other sort of example of supply-side economics. When you talked about Janet Yellen, Brian Deese, Lael Brainerd, and others on the left, in the Biden administration, they've used the term modern supply-side economics. And one, I think we should all view that as success, that rhetorically at least we're winning that battle, that right now with massive inflation, you can't use the argument we're trapped in a demand slump. You have to use the argument that we're in a supply-side shock, that we don't have enough goods being produced. So the inflation is partially one of the reasons. Some of that rhetorical strategy has moved over into the supply side focus. But when you look at what Janet Yellen said for modern supply side economics, she says, well, what it really needs is the government needs to put the foundation for an economy to propel the private sector ahead. She says, well, we need child care subsidies to help people get back to work. We need targeted infrastructure investment for certain places that have been left behind. We need to get rid of discriminatory burdens in the private sector. What all this amounts to is, of course, not too dissimilar from a traditional leftist agenda with a slightly different overarching sort of tagline or explanation. And so it's about taxing, it's about creating new regulations, about specific government investments in specific areas, and that's not the supply side. The supply side, the fundamental insight beyond the fact that the only thing holding back the economy long term is supply, not demand, as John Maynard Keynes or some others would claim. The fundamental insight is the private economy is almost always a positive sum game. When two people trade with each other, they do that because that fundamentally brings benefits to both, and they leave the trade better off than they went into it. And that most, but not all of what government does is fundamentally a negative sum game. Not just that you take from A and give to B, but in taking from A, you discourage the sorts of trades that you would like in the first sort of supply side example, because you're taxing activities, income, sales, or whatever, what have you. But two, you also discourage work and investment in general. And the regulation that the Biden administration and others talks about is exactly the classic example of inhibiting those free trade in goods and services that makes our economy grow. So, you know, I'm very encouraged by partially, I think, the intellect, just by the nature of the current environment, that rhetorically the supply side is becoming more prominent. But when you look in practice on what the left and most of the administrations are doing, you're not seeing a lot of this being put in place yet. Long term, maybe those intellectuals will have a lot more influence, but so far you're not seeing it being implemented in a way that traditional supply-siders would recognize.
Eli, I want to hear you respond to that, but also I want to bring in to this discussion an essay written by our fearless leader, Reihan Salam, for The Atlantic recently, where he made the point that one of the problems with modern supply-side theory as understood by the left isn't so much that the ideas or a lack of progressive discipline to unleash productivity, to remove obstacles obstacles in front of development, but rather the coalition of the modern left almost militates against the adoption of some of the policies that you or I would like to see. So maybe you could conjoin those two.
Absolutely. So look, even if you're a Marxist and you want to seize the means of production, there have to be means of production, right? So I think it's important and good that the progressive left has started to realize that and has started to see it. I think, in particular, that the climate hawks are really the leaders here, right? We have spent a ton of money through the Inflation Reduction Act, or we are spending a ton of money through the Inflation Reduction Act addressing climate priorities. And it turns out that's not enough if you want to build a lot of clean energy infrastructure in this country. You have to tackle the regulatory obstacles like permitting to be able to do it. I think another area where they're starting to see it is in housing regulation, and particularly in blue cities. We're seeing land use regulations stifle building of new houses, and you know, affordable housing. If affordable housing is a priority, then you have to be able to address the ability to build new housing. I think Judge is right to point out like the muscular state aspect of the, sort of their view, the idea of the entrepreneurial state, the industrial policy aspect of that. I think that is misguided, and that's what separates, I think, the sort of conservative supply, or should separate the conservative supply side movement from the progressive supply side movement. I think Reihan's piece was spot on in terms of identifying the problem of the Democratic Party is not a coherent ideological movement. It is a family as a coalition cobbled together of disparate interests, and we're seeing conflicts within that coalition between the even within like sort of the environmental segment of that coalition between the conservationists and the climate priority folks, and so they're butting heads. And I think we're seeing a recognition. Ezra Klein wrote this article on everything bagel liberalism, which I think is in a similar vein of recognizing we can't actually address every single priority that our coalition has in every single project. And so I think there's a growing recognition on the left. I think it's to be welcomed. I think we should push back on some of the industrial policy aspects of it. But I think one cheer or maybe two cheers for the progressive left to start to recognize this.
Yeah, in a way, it's like Justice Elena Kagan saying we're all originalists now. We're all supply-siders now. Judge, I want to ask you, though, on that question of political coalitions, if it is true that just the way in which certain democratic interest groups interact with one another would prevent the passage of supply-side policy, say permitting reform, say housing reform, what does a pro-supply side coalition look like in your view? What are kind of the bases of support that conservatives can build on to further these ideas?
It's certainly not impossible, and historically it happened, because those of you who are the students of the history of regulation and deregulation know that there was a fairly bipartisan deregulation movement in the late 1970s. It was none other than Senator Ted Kennedy who took the lead in deregulating air travel, and his then assistant, future Justice Stephen Breyer. And when someone asked him, why are you caring about air travel? None of your constituents fly. And he said, that's why I care about it. They're not able to fly. It's because of this regulation that's keeping them back. And in the 1970s, we had the greatest spur of deregulation in American history, not just air travel, but also railroads, banking, trucking. Everything basically that was holding the American economy back was removed in a very bipartisan fashion. So that possibility is always there and will remain there. Partially, there's just a nature when enough coalitions are inhibited by a certain regulation that's maybe directed at one of them, they can gang up on that sole group that is inhibiting the rest of them from achieving their ends. And you see this exactly with housing and climate, where they're willing to take on some of the traditional Democratic constituency because they, even if they are a concentrated interest group, are being inhibited by those other groups. But traditionally, that's just going to always be more problematic for the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. If you look at writers like Matt Grossman, or even going back to the 60s, someone like Theodore Lowy, who was talking about the Second Republic, which was just an American republic in the post-New Deal era that had become a concatenation of interest groups. There was no conception of a singular public interest that traditionally the Republicans tried to represent, as opposed to a collection of individual group interests. The magazine you referenced, The Public Interest, was precisely trying to articulate a sole general interest, not a collection of interest group interest. And as long as the contemporary Democratic Party remains what it is, which by many political science measures has a much tighter connection to a large variety of interest group, that sort of broad public coalition is always going to be more difficult. Not impossible, as we saw in the 1970s, but certainly more difficult to surmount.
Yeah. Historically, supply side was really understood as a tax reform movement. It was caught up in the stagflation era. It came of age during the tax revolt in California and elsewhere. It was culminated in the Reagan tax reforms of 81 and then again in 86. But I think when we look at the landscape today, the next supply side agenda is going to have to privilege other interests or topics before we get to taxes, right? I mean, in some ways that's a result of Reagan's success, right? Bracket creep was a real thing in the 70s. It was driving a lot of people to support low tax rates. But then, of course, thanks to Norman Ture and Reagan, we index for inflation, not so much a problem. And of course, we've also raised the standard deduction, exempting many people from the tax rolls. So it seems to me, anyway, that deregulation is probably the next big frontier for supply side. And I want to start there. And with you, Eli, you've written quite a bit about the importance of building, how we need to build things, how we need to get back to kind of a hard tech outlook as opposed to a software outlook. What are the regulatory barriers to that, and what would be your priorities be in advising public officials?
I look at this from the perspective of like, look, this is America. This is the land of the free. You can innovate in any way you want, as long as nobody is inconvenienced, nobody loses their job, and nobody can possibly get hurt, which doesn't leave a lot of scope. And so I think that, where does that leave us? It leaves, the problems that we actually have is we have a lot of vetocracy. We have a lot of make-work policies that prevent people from losing, job churn in the market, and we have a lot of safety regulation, a lot of safety theater in our regulation. So that needs to be addressed. I think in terms of sectorally, we have to address the big chunks of GDP, the big sectors that have stagnated over the last 50 years, right? I think the success story, if I was going to tell the success story of American innovation in the last 50 years, it's been IT, like Silicon Valley. No one else in the world does that the way we do. And I would say the next thing that would be kind of close would be or probably not close, but still significant, is fracking. And then in a lot of other sectors, right, like health, housing, transportation, some aspects of energy, we have completely stagnated. And innovation in those areas, it's not driven just by new ideas. You have to actually be able to deploy the new ideas and use the new ideas in the marketplace. And we're having incredible progress, for example, in university level biology, the labs. These guys are wizards, what they're able to do in a biology lab these days. But it's not translating to medicine, right? And it's because we impose a lot of barriers along the way. So I would flag those sectors that I mentioned, and I would flag those issues in each of those. We got to be okay with destroying jobs, because that's how we increase productivity. We have to be okay with not everybody, there's going to be some things that backfire and people get hurt, and there's going to be some people that are inconvenienced, and tough cookies. When you grow the economy, it's going to outweigh your inconvenience. It's going to be better for everybody.
Judge, who would you tell tough cookies to?
That's a tough one. That's a tough cookie in and of itself. So it's obviously my answer is going to be a lot of the people in this town right here who do make a good living, and I'm not against it. I grew up around here in a family in the civil service, and a lot of very necessary stuff goes on here. But there's a lot of obviously very unnecessary stuff goes on, and most of that does have to do with that regulation, which is preventing, as the old philosopher Robert Nozick said, capitalistic acts between consenting adults. The fact that we're having people inhibited from merely making deals with each other, merely making trades that they clearly want to do because there's some burden or some regulation deep in the bowels of the code of federal regulations preventing them from doing that is a great injustice. And frankly, I think it's obviously the center of the next populist revolt. It is a fundamentally populist issue, which is having largely graduate school individuals, people who've graduated from higher education, telling the vast majority of Americans who have not actually graduated even from college how to run their lives, how to run their trucking firms, how to start their businesses, how much they have to pay, where they have to go, and so forth. And we know this is growing, even if those kind of high marginal tax rates aren't. Some measures that just look at the Code of Federal Regulations. We have terrible ways to measure this, but some we just literally count pages. And so the Code of the Federal Regulations is now up, I want to say, about 220,000 pages. It's been continuously going up for the past 40, 50 years. The Federal Register, which is just the annual issue of regulations of the federal government, that's hit around 80,000 pages a year. This has continuously gone up to even since the Reagan era. And what do you have now? You have estimates about $1 to $2 trillion in cost annually from federal regulation. Now, pre-pandemic, the whole federal government only spent about $4 trillion. So you have kind of this invisible government of regulation that's imposing trillions of dollars in burdens on American, but it's largely been hidden. I think one of the things we saw during the COVID crisis is how powerful some of those regulators could be, not just for issues like drugs and medical devices getting out and tests and so forth, but obviously for very pervasive regulations such as lockdowns and so forth. And I think that will both be important. Obviously, that has both energized a lot of people to fight against those regulations. And it's also, frankly, it's also energized a lot of lawyers and other people kind of in the traditional originalist constitutional structure that you mentioned, the originalism before, to look at this again, where we have a government that can largely, without asking Congress to do things, have immense amount of effects across all of our daily lives without ever taking a vote. When I lived in California, I lived in a state where if the public health official woke up with a bad stomach that morning, they could decide to keep you inside your house that week or next week or next week. That is a terrifying thought. They never had votes on most of these things. Someone just decided from inside their office building whether or not me and my kids could go outside. I think that should give all of us a lot of pause, and I think it did give a lot of Americans a lot of pause, and that makes me somewhat optimistic long term, both at the popular reaction against that and some of those constitutional lawyers who are bringing suits about this to try to reestablish a more traditional framework of government that makes it more limited and less likely for those bureaucrats without any electoral sort of mandate to control everyday lives.
Within that sphere of regulation, there are two main areas, it seems to me. One is energy/infrastructure, and the other is housing. So, Eli, there's been a lot of discussion on Capitol Hill recently, beginning with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, but then again with the debt ceiling deal about permitting reform, something that was worked on during the Trump administration, and then it seems Senator Joe Manchin has brought it up again. What's the state of play on permitting reform? What needs to be done? What can be done to accelerate projects from conception to reality?
Well, the permitting reform that passed in the debt ceiling bill was woefully inadequate. I mean, it's mostly codification of existing practice or existing judicial interpretations. A few areas where maybe we actually step backwards. I would point to like codification of the environmental assessment process, which was entirely a regulatory creation until Congress codified it. And then some other things that are going to be very hard to enforce, like time limits on environmental reviews. So if you are a company, like the only way those time limits get enforced is if you sue the agency. And you know, a lot of companies that they deal with agencies on a like repeat business basis, and they don't want to anger the agency. So I think that's going to largely go unenforced. I think, first of all, like the best solution is repeal NEPA. It's a bad law. It's not the framework we need. It was put in place before we had any other environmental policies, including any other substantive protections on the environment. And NEPA is purely a procedural law, and you would argue if you have substantive protections, then why do you need procedural ones? And procedural ones just take time, and they don't provide any substantive protection. But assuming NEPA is going to stay in place, I think that the top priorities need to be eliminating the environmental assessment process as a mandatory part of the process. So you're supposed to do a report to determine if there is significant impacts, and then which would then lead you to have to then go on and do a longer or more detailed environmental impact statement. What's happening in practice is that agencies are looking at the decision, they're deciding whether it is significant or non-significant, and then if it's not significant, then they do the environmental assessment because the full environmental impact statement isn't required, and they don't want to do both, and so they're deciding informally first, and so that is actually the bulk of the environmental paperwork is these environmental assessments. We do about 12,000 of them a year versus only like 200 environmental impact statements. So it's crazy that 98% of the paperwork is being generated to address projects that do not have a significant environmental impact. It's insane. And then the other aspect of it that would be important would be reforming judicial review of environmental documents. So NEPA does not have its own cause of action. It's addressed through the APA. If you sue under the APA, if you go to court. But the standard way of dealing with it is, a court will issue an injunction while the trial is going on to determine if the agency violated NEPA. And then if he finds that they did violate NEPA, he vacates the agency decision. And I think fixing those two problems, eliminating injunctions and vacating the agency decision, just send it back to the agency if you must, and they can fix the environmental document, but don't vacate the decision. I think those would be the two judicial reforms that I think are necessary to make it work.
Judge, how do we get to a world where we have bountiful nuclear energy in the United States?
I'll let Eli talk about some of that, but the answer may not surprise you that it is largely deregulation, especially with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The other issue is all of those environmental burdens and other things that that Eli's talked about. Eli, do I do a punt? Can I punt it right here?
Of course.
Oh, yeah.
I've actually perfect.
Your answer is listen to Eli Dorado.
No, I have a perfectly articulate, beautifully thought out answer, but I'm going to let Eli try it anyway.
Okay.
Because he's probably got a better, more articulate, beautifully thought out answer.
Yeah, I think that there's a few things. So one is nuclear regulation is done under the assumption that the slightest amount of radiation exposure is damaging. So I like to talk about radiation in terms of banana equivalent doses, because even a banana has radiation, measurable, significant radiation. And so every time you eat a banana, you're exposing yourself to radiation. And in fact, all of us have radiation. Radiation is everywhere. And so if you have granite countertops, guess what? That has pretty high measurable radiation. So I think relaxing the assumptions about the amount of radiation that is acceptable, I think designing the nuclear regulations so as to prevent a major release of radioactive material rather than the way they're designed now, which is to make sure that absolutely nothing can ever go wrong. So I think if instead the regulations were we're going to allow certain things to go wrong, but we're going to do everything we can to prevent a major release, I think that would be a better way to do it. So I think that is a regulatory reform. I think there's other aspects of the way the government deals with nuclear that are also extremely harmful. So for example, we have in the United States a national reactor laboratory. It's Idaho National Labs. Can anybody guess the last time that Idaho National Labs spun up a brand new reactor? 1967, right? And so what should they be doing, right? So in my view is Idaho National Labs should be they have an exemption from NRC regulation, right? Because they're a national lab, they just happen to. And so they should be contracting with every single small modular reactor company and say, we will pay you to come to our facilities and build the first version of your reactor here in our facilities under our exemption. And then those companies would be able to have data about how their reactors work, and then they show that data to the NRC, and that would speed along the approval process. So there's the regulatory framework is wrong. We're not doing everything we can to help in the national labs context, and we really need that to be able to solve this chicken and egg problem of we don't have data to prove that our reactor is safe because we're not allowed to run our reactor.
A lot of these issues, when we get into the deregulatory space, they present a kind of challenges that these tax-cutting supply-siders didn't have. Jude Wanniski, who was one of the most devoted popularizers of supply-side theory, wrote a famous essay called The Two Santa Claus Theory, where he said, we spent all these decades where the Democratic Party was Santa Claus. They were giving goodies to all the voter groups, and in return, voters gave the Democratic Party loyalty. And it was time, Wanniski wrote, that the Republicans play Santa Claus too, by giving voters tax cuts, and that way they would engender partisan loyalty as well. But when we're talking about nuclear plants, when we're talking about zoning, you get this NIMBYism effect, right? And just two recent examples. Across the river in recent months, there was extremely heated and polarized debate over changing zoning laws in Arlington, Virginia to allow multi-family housing. The measure passed, and there will be changes to Arlington zoning, but it was a very contentious debate. And just last weekend, Eli, I know that you've written about the supersonic transport. Just last weekend, though, this area was paralyzed for about an hour as we tried to figure out what that huge sonic boom was in the sky, and then we learned it was the two F-16s dispatched to intercept the wayward plane. So that too, like a world where those sonic booms were happening on the hour might occasion some pushback from constituent groups. I'm wondering, Judge, and I'll just start with you, and you can't punt on this question. How do we overcome that? How do we overcome the NIMBYism that seems to be, kind of entrenched when you're dealing with these tough regulatory issues?
Well, there's two things. One, there's a famous book by, I think, Jones and Baumgarten, two political scientists, about agendas in American political history, about why do some of these areas that are kind of closed off from public debate suddenly become public issues and then suddenly see a large mass or majority overcome, which is largely an interior group of beneficiaries. This is the classic that benefits are widely dispersed, or the costs are widely dispersed, but the benefits are fairly concentrated. And that's in innumerable number of spheres of American life. And they look at it and say, why does this happen? And sometimes, usually it's some crisis, some catastrophe happens, and then all of a sudden people do care about nuclear. You have power go out in certain areas, and people start caring about power reliability. You have hearings that suddenly happen on Capitol Hill, where this group that kind of was able to receive a lot of benefits outside the public eye suddenly gets in the public eye, and that majoritarian impulse can overcome that sort of minoritarian impulse to keep those concentrated benefits. So I think that's always the possibility. And as I mentioned during the COVID crisis and other examples, you had a lot of examples of where a lot of incidents of where the public realized that a small group was benefiting or a small group was holding up benefits that could accrue to the large majority. And I think the other side of this is looking at where there can be obvious win-win situations. And I think there's a large number of them. One of the things I've written about is NIMBYism, is that a lot of this actually comes from bad municipal finance structures, where the local governments used to be able to benefit a lot from property taxes. In a way now, in our attempts to redistribute property taxes, we made local governments absorb all of the costs of new growth and receive none of the benefits. And trying to restore those costs and benefits together for local governments will make them more like the growth machines that were famous and common in the 1950s and 60s, when we had all of these regulatory burdens, but they weren't so burdensome precisely because these local governments wanted to build more. Now, the other side of this is one of my hobby horses, and this gets a little bit to the tax and regulation example of, well, where we have all of these systems, the taxing and spending example, we have all these taxing programs we often conceive as taking from A and giving to B. And something I've written about for a few years back was, well, actually a lot of American government, a surprising amount, is taking from A and giving right back to A at this point. We have a welfare state that's so comprehensive where almost the majority of all American households are receiving some sort of benefits. And at the same time, the majority of American households are also, of course, paying taxes. Most income taxes, but also payroll taxes, sales taxes, tariffs on what they consume abroad, local property tax, et cetera. So how much of American government at this point is not redistributing from one interest group to another, but is actually taken from from your family and then giving you back in a more diluted form? They're taxing you on payrolls and then giving you food stamps. They're taxing you on sales tax and then giving you a housing voucher. This is absolutely insane. No American actually wants to have their money taken from them just to have it given back in a less useful form by the government. And I tried to do some estimate about this, and imagine about 20% of all American entitlement welfare spending is probably going back to the exact same families that paid at least that much in taxes in that same year. Can that be a majoritarian impulse where we're saying, hey, we're not talking about different interest groups, just stop taking from one pocket and giving them in the other pocket? So I think there's a lot of these opportunities here. We can show where they're win-win situations, and actually sometimes that involves kind of buying out those local interest groups, and sometimes they can show where we can all benefit just by reducing those collective burdens.
Eli?
Well, the supersonic issue is very near and dear to my heart. I used to work at a supersonic company and ran their government affairs and so on. So if any Hill staffers are in the audience and want to fix supersonics, I have a one-sentence provision for you, so come find me. I think that this is one thing that I really want to blame on the progressives, right? So in the 1960s and 70s, there was this idea that democracy is not just going to the polls and voting, right? The democracy is like everybody participating in the government, right? And every single person getting a voice like forever, right? And just never, you never end the argument, right? And so what this has ended up with is vetocracy. And that is, no way to run a country. So I think that it would be very beneficial if we started to look at democracy more as like you go and you vote for people, and then it's like those people's turn to govern, and if you don't like it, you vote them out. Instead of we're gonna empower every single person to participate in government. And a lot of times, the idea of participatory democracy is seen as a populist thing, we're gonna empower the people who, we don't hear from or whatever. That's not actually what happens, right? It's very well connected people who can hire attorneys and can navigate the process that sort of are able to exploit that process. So I think reconceptualizing, I think seeing this like democracy as voice, for everybody at every level in every decision, I think that's really the root of the problem.
And if I can just add to that, I mean, one of my favorite lines that someone pointed out to me was that when you allow more people to attend these meetings and have a voice in government, it will mean rule by the people. But what it actually means is rule by the people who love meetings. And I don't know what the Greek term for that is, but it's actually the worst form of government. Whoever you want to govern you, whatever, some people like the broad public spectrum, there's even elitists who want a small group to govern. The worst people to govern are the people who love to attend meetings, and that's what we have for a lot of American government today.
Before we turn to the audience, I want to spend a little bit of time on a major topic and one that's consuming a lot of ink on the right these days, and that's industrial policy. Judge, you've written quite a bit about industrial policy, about the way it's been done, about the way to do it right, about current advocates of industrial policy. How should the right think about industrial policy and its place in our political economy?
They should think about it less, ideally. So what is industrial policy? I think worthwhile starting at that because there is a lot of discussion about it, but very little definition. And I think industrial policy is best thought about government directing capital, the means of production in the Marxist verbiage, into certain spheres or areas. The government trying to decide where productive capital should be located. And we all know there is just an absolutely lamentable history of government doing this. There is no coherent reason why government is better at selecting investments than the alternatives. Back in the 80s, we used to have the example of the Ministry of International Trade and Investment, the Japanese kind of industrial policy department. The people celebrated as this great example of what was making Japan go forward. And now we know, of course, that was complete bupkis. If we look at the returns on what they invested in versus what the private market invested in, they did, not surprisingly, much worse. The general political economy problem with industrial policy is precisely that there's always a very large constituency for existing stagnant industries, and there's very little constituency for new innovative industries that don't exist yet. For the obvious reason, those people aren't voters yet. So the government trying to take capital and trying to redirect it in certain spheres is largely not helpful. And the new revival of this on the right end and the left as well is somewhat distressing considering that background. Now, the only thing I will give a bit of a qualifier for that is that going back to Adam Smith and Wealth of a Nation, he recognized that there's a national defense sort of exemption to industrial policy. That if we do not want to take the most kind of glaring reductio ad absurdum example, we do not want to contract out our tank production to Shanghai. Probably not a good example. Now, when we get a little further away from that, it becomes a little tougher. We have something over in the Department of Commerce here called the Bureau of Industry and Security, which decides on what are called dual-use products and whether or not we can export those to our enemies or whether or not other places can potentially import those to America. And, I think there's a worthwhile debate. How many of these things should we not necessarily allow to fall in the hands of what can be considered enemies? Now, where I would bracket that with, and where this conversation might be somewhat difficult, is we absolutely want those technologies and our investment to free flow and are even contracting from government and investment from domestic ventures abroad to go to our allies, because we absolutely need some of our allies to fight back against our enemies. How did we contain the Soviet Union internationally in the 60s and 70s? We had free trade agreements, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. We had free flow of capital. We were encouraging through the IMF and the World Bank the increasing free flow of capital around the world. Now, those of us who are saying, well, those people are saying, well, we need more, say, semiconductor manufacturing at home, not in China. I can understand that argument, but when that moves over to, well, we want to take away semiconductor production from South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, which are the three countries that we most need to ally against what we all agree is the common foe in the area, China, well, then we're talking about not just industrial policy that's not helping national security, it's actually hindering it. And we need to make sure that as we're protecting defense critical industries, we're not pushing out our allies, that we also need to make sure they are strong and they are economically dynamic and they're not falling into the clutches of China's increasingly expansive trade and infrastructure regime.
And this became an issue too with the IRA, right? Some of the Made in America provisions have come back to haunt the Biden administration through the protests of France and others. Eli, I mean, Judge brings up China. Just recently, Elon Musk was in China showcasing Tesla. They're going to open up a Tesla fab there. Greg Ip in the Wall Street Journal had quite an eye-opening piece just the other day. China's EV juggernaut is a warning for the West. How do you look at industrial policy should we be copying the Chinese if this green EV revolution is going to be the wave of the future? Or should we be developing our own domestic EV industry? Or is it all kind of a fool's errand in Judge's conception?
So I will incorporate by reference all of Judge's remarks. But I would say, look, I would say industrial policy is neither necessary nor sufficient, right? So it's definitely not sufficient, as we're finding out in the clean tech industry, right? We have all kinds of industrial policy going into climate-related stuff, and it turns out we're standing in our own way, right? With all the permitting obstacles and so on. So if we actually removed all the barriers that people face when they try to invest in the economy, I think we would find that we don't need the government subsidies and direction of capital in the first place. And so an example related to EVs is mining, right? Mining for metals. Like, we do a lot of oil and gas mining in this country, but we do not mine for minerals. Like, we've stopped, right? Because it is environmentally sensitive and damaging. So what do? We export the environmental degradation to other countries where they're even less sensitive and they do it worse. And so we don't do enough of that. I think it's definitely true that China has been a huge driver of cost reductions in batteries. They've been a huge driver of cost reductions in solar panels. And they are just willing to scale up manufacturing in ways that we have not been able to do, I think, in large part because of the barriers that are put in, and I would include the mining industry in that. And so, Tesla does have U.S. facilities. It has European facilities as well, and those facilities are very impressive and have advanced the game as well. So it's not like we can't do it. But we definitely need more. I think we need U.S. elites, basically, to think bigger, to think more ambitiously, to have more of an internal locus of control, and to sort of innovate on that scale and be willing to charge through the barriers and tear the barriers down, and then you won't need a lot of government support.
Before we open up to questions from the audience, Judge, I just have one question for you. In recent years, the Republican Party has become the party of the non-elite, the party of the forgotten men and women, the party of rural America or deindustrialized America. So if you could sit down a policymaker who wants to know how this new supply side economics can improve their community, which is in the Rust Belt and which has been on hard times, what would you tell them?
I think Eli alluded to the important point there, and I think in some respects this is similar to my earlier point I made about the taxing with one hand and then giving with the other. It's very strange to me you have so many members of the Republican Party that come out and say, well, we need some new X, Y, and Z industrial policy program to help industry, when government is so obviously intervening in so many different aspects of industry today. Why are you going to have a program that's going to impose, according to some measures, about $20,000 per employee in federal regulatory cost in the manufacturing sector, and then say, well, at the same time, I'm going to give you a $5,000 per employee subsidy on manufacturing? It seems to me in a similar way, just cut out both of those things. Instead of giving with one hand and taxing the corporate business sector and imposing regulations on them, instead of posing the 2001 program in the catalog of federal domestic assistance, which is the big federal catalog of all of our different programs, why don't we just get rid of the one that we all agree is clear and inhibiting that existing industry? Manufacturing bears the overwhelming burden of cost today. If you look at regulatory costs, the costs for a manufacturing employee are about twice as high in terms of the regulatory burden than they are in the rest of the country. This is holding the working class, the traditional blue-collar working manufacturing class back than anywhere else. And that's precisely, I think, why you were seeing an increased movement into the Republican Party of that class, because they don't care so much if they have a union protecting them, if they can't get a job or a factory started, precisely because there's no way they're going to meet the local national ambient air quality standards if they have a new factory in town. And so I think this is, deregulation is going to be a core populist issue, and it's obviously the best way to revive manufacturing in America.
Any thoughts, Eli?
Look, I mean, I basically see politics as like the median voter gets what they want over some long enough time horizon, and the median voter cares about a lot of like cultural issues and a lot of like relatively easy to understand political issues that are on the news all the time. When you get into deregulation, right, it's a lot of in the weeds stuff. It's a lot of, you really have to understand the dynamics of, how the different agencies work, or like, how the business interacts with the agency. And so to me, it seems that it takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of intellectual firepower to actually have a deregulatory movement. So I think the deregulatory movement will always be like a little biased towards elites doing it. And I think that to the extent that the median voter, doesn't comprehend or does not care to engage with those ideas, it means that it won't be a populist thing. It will be elites, like sort of on the side, like hopefully elites in both parties agreeing that we need to deregulate, and then the median voter can continue to have their way on like abortion or wokeness or whatever it is that they actually care about.
Well, let's hear from some non-median voters now. We have some microphones, I think, in the audience. So if you just raise your hand if you have a question for the panel, please put your statement in the form of a question. That would help us. Any questions for this distinguished group? Yes, sir.
Thank you all for the conversation. If I could rewind you back to what a supply-side movement might look like with this discussion of regulatory reform, Judge, your comments focused on sectoral deregulation, banking, transportation, et cetera. To what extent do you see political coalitions available for institutional reforms? Executive branch, legislative branch. We have some 460 plus agencies with rulemaking authority that have legislative force. Is there a coalition to be found there as opposed to just at HHS or just at transportation or just at labor?
Yeah, I think to some extent, and this was one of the surprising things, what you saw over the last 5 or 6 years. The Trump administration was often considered, and with justice, to highlight a more populist, more interventionist form of government that was supposedly in line with the new preferences of the Republican Party. But what was the area that had the most unambiguous sort of success and the most unambiguous alliance with the traditional Republican Party? And that was deregulation. Now, you looked at that, what that happened over those 4 years. Now, it wasn't much. And, some people who totaled the cost sort of that came out of the new regulations then era say it was about zero. If you include the independent agencies, they imposed about $40 billion in new regulatory cost, which sounds not so great until you consider that the Obama administration imposed about $100 billion in new regulatory costs a year. So, this was massive annual new regulatory costs that were double or triple what was being imposed in the entire Trump administration. So, and they had a lot of significant deregulatory successes in areas like the Clean Power Plan and the auto emissions standards and corporate average fuel economy for new autos. So I think you saw an example where people, even if, as Eli points out, most of them wouldn't know what CAFE standards were or whatever, but you saw an example where you had these numerous agencies populated largely by well-educated, elite adults that were imposing a lot of costs and telling a lot of average Americans what to do in their different spheres. And they were realizing they're making their car more expensive. Now, some of the particular areas where this shoe is going to pinch, I think we're seeing right now, if they ban incandescent lights, you're going to see hell break out for people. If they ban, what's the other one that's on the agenda right now? Gas stoves. If you see gas stoves, a regulatory thing you can see, which was, again, proposed to be a ridiculous Republican conspiracy theory as recently as 6 months ago and now is actually in practice in numerous locations and potentially at the federal level, you're going to see a riot break out. One of the minor examples of regulation that I like to use is the 1992 Energy Policy Act, which actually imposed a new flow limit for new toilets as a water-saving measure. And you rightfully had people throughout their country saying that I'm dealing with clogged toilets because of what somebody in D.C. thought my toilet should only issue so many gallons of water per flush. You have examples like this where the shoe starts to really pinch, and I think you're seeing this in a bunch of examples, and I think you're seeing the desire to roll back those regulations in Greece. Now, that's not always sectoral, but I think like case by case, you're seeing an example of people getting angry at individual regulations and being angry at the kind of entire regulatory state that's imposing them, which makes me somewhat optimistic that you can have another example of like what you saw in the 70s and early 80s.
Question. Another here in front.
So on the topic of regulation, which I thought was interesting because, as you guys say, particularly with the Trump administration, that was one of the few areas where kind of there was broad agreement, between kind of the populist wing and the more traditional conservatives. But based on what you guys are saying, and you know a lot more than I do about this, it seems that Obama and the Democrats, when they come to power, they put a lot of regulation that's really damaging, and then the Republicans, they maybe slow it down or reduce it a little, right? But we're probably not going to have, given politics in this country, we're not going to have Republican rule for 10 years. So in terms of assuming there was like broad alignment or broader alignment to try to push back these regulations, what is the vehicle? How does one actually go about, assuming you had broad popular support, rolling back all these regulations? Because these are incredibly complex, and obviously not everybody's going to be against all regulations, right? I mean, for example, Trump, he did tariffs, and there's probably regulations there. What do we allow, not allow? So is it through Congress? Is it through the courts? How would someone go about really denting it, going from 200,000 pages to 100,000 pages, as opposed to stopping it from going to 210 to 202? How do you actually tackle this problem in a real way, and what would be the vehicles and the processes by which that would be done? Thank you.
I'll go briefly, and I would love to hear Eli's thoughts on this too, but I mean, in one way, the success is not going to be cutting regulations in half. I forget what Trump originally said, 70% cut in regulations, which was always infeasible. But you had about a 70% cut in the flow of new regulations, which obviously nowhere near the same sort of impact as one would hope on those sort of things. But as the economy continues to grow, if you keep regulation stable, similar to keeping tax and spending rate stable, you're going to get a lot more growth that's kind of outside those regulatory strictures. Now, that's not ideal. That's kind of what you saw in the 1970s and 80s. And I think we can get closer there. Now, the other side of that, and just kind of restricting the new growth, is obviously the courts. You have what it looks like maybe a majority overturned Chevron deference, which is the 1984 case that allowed agencies to basically have carte blanche to do whatever they wanted, which is, I point out, one of the main leaders of this is Justice Gorsuch, whose mom was actually on the other side of that case. She was the EPA chief that was trying to impose a new broad regulation that was actually deregulatory regulation. But let's not get into all of that. But you have a case where now the regulatories are largely moving in one direction. One of the reasons the Reagan administration and the courts back then were allowing the regulators some more authority is because they were engaged in a deregulatory process. And now you have a largely one-way ratchet, and you're going to have the courts that look like are going to overturn that kind of carte blanche ability for the regulators to impose new costs without looking at the Congress, without looking at the costs and benefits, where you've seen in some examples of the SEC and others. And I'm fairly optimistic about those court measures as well.
So I agree on courts. I would add that the alternative to rule by regulation is rule by Congress. So Congress really needs to step up and exercise more domain expertise and more, like actually be involved in the finer points of governing. And that's the only way, I think, in the long run that you can like decrease reliance on bureaucrats. And then I think the other point I'll make is that those of us in the sort of the ideas business, we're not all that there is. When I was at the Mercatus Center, I wrote a wonderful paper on supersonics and how we could deregulate supersonics. That paper circulated in the Trump administration, it circulated at DOT, et cetera. Didn't really move the needle, but people read it. And then I went in-house at a company and was able to make the case forcefully to the agency, and I got very high-level meetings with FAA, and we didn't get everything I wanted, but we got some things that I wanted. And so agencies listen to companies that are trying to do stuff, right? And I think that's an underrated vector for change. Is people need to start new companies trying to mine or trying to build challenging things, and sort of this what I call the hard tech industry, and then advocate for themselves within Congress and within the agencies. And I think that they get taken a lot more seriously sometimes than I wish we in the ideas world were.
That helps, and I would make my one example too of, does anyone remember who the villain is insofar as there was a villain besides the ghost in the Ghostbusters movie from 1984 or whenever it is?
It's the EPA.
It's a pettifogging EPA bureaucrat. Are there times in American history where these bureaucratic regulators become so anathema that the popular media and video and film and so forth can actually make them the villains? Yes, that can happen.
You're just making the case for why the 80s is the best decade ever.
Exactly. What's another great winner? I'm just waiting for the next, maybe someone knows that there's another great movie with, there was the Dallas Buyers Club, which was about the FDA being the evil group preventing it. There are times where this can happen, where this can become not just an inside the Beltway elite discourse, but a popular discourse about how regulators are preventing people from doing what they want to do.
Yeah, I would just also say, to your very good question, the original supply-siders didn't think that they were going to get rid of government or the welfare state. In fact, Jack Kemp was a defender of the welfare state. He called himself a bleeding heart conservative. Their goal was always to increase the size of the private economy relative to the public sector. And as long as you kept growing the private economy and keeping public sector expenses relatively stable, right, that delta could produce all sorts of innovation and productivity enhancement and material abundance that would be enough to live with. So it was never the idea, we're just going to get rid of every regulation, but we can just target a few areas that are especially in need of deregulation while slowing the flood of regulation from DC. Then you're going to create a lot of opportunities for novelty and wealth and prosperity. Any other questions? Tom? Right down here.
So I agree with your comments on rulemaking, but how do you decrease the rulemaking when each agency has this power through proposed rulemaking to impose them kind of almost irrespective of what Congress might want. I mean, don't you have to start somewhere along that line to stop if you're going to stop the new rules, you've got to change the process for being able to make those new rules. Where does that stand in the?
It stands in that it's starting to go backwards again. And so what you saw, Biden administration recently released the OMB Circular A4, which is the rules about how we make rules. And they basically said there's the group inside the government that some are in the executive branch that some of you are aware of, the OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, that supervises all of these different agencies that have power to make rules. And the Biden administration, their new regulation about regulations said we're only going to look at rules if they cost up to $200 million instead of $100 million. And we're going to impose all these other reasons why OIRA and the White House shouldn't supervise these these regulators. And that's pretty distressing. I mean, in the sense of it's strange. They're so confident that they agree with the new regulations coming out. They don't even want a Democratic White House to oversee what's going to happen. They'd rather have them just shoved out the door as quickly as possible. But, you know, OIRA originally set up under another Jimmy Carter. It was the Paperwork Reduction Act in 1980 that started it. Reagan really made it, brought it into fore. But centering power in the White House again, which is an elected official and an OIRA chief, ideally appointed directly by him, who can supervise all these different regulatory agencies and weigh the costs and benefits. Now, Trump's executive order, I think 13771, which was the two out, one in sort of order, you know, didn't do that perfectly, but they had a lot more going through the White House. And I think reestablishing that and ideally making Congress say that, no, you guys don't have independent power to do whatever you want. This has to go through at least some elected official. I think that would be a big step. And unfortunately, that's not where we're heading right now.
Do you have a question, Reihan?
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on demographic vitality. There's a line of argument that even when you're looking at underlying productivity growth, that when you don't have robust growth in the labor force, that does have a material effect. There's also an argument about animal spirits, extending from demographic vitality and the absence of demographic vitality. So if we stipulate that, look, there's leverage on the immigration side, even there, Latin America has a replacement rate, they're below replacement rate. East Asia is well below replacement. So when you look at traditional sources of potential migrants, those places are aging pretty rapidly as well. How do you think about rapid aging shaping the prospects for economic abundance, rising productivity? Eli, I know you've thought a lot about this in the context of, for example, extending healthy lifespan, but I'm curious to hear from both of you about, the demographic picture and how it shapes things.
So I'm very concerned about demographics. I think a lot of the la-la land that we've been in the economy for the last 20 years, or where we had like ultra low interest rates and stuff, that was like a demographic bubble caused by the baby boom just sort of being late career, and now they're retiring. And so now we're getting back to economic reality. So it drives like incredibly important things. The US is in amazing shape relative to our peer countries, right? So first of all, we have a Gen Z. A lot of countries don't, right? Gen Z is very big, and a lot of countries, like Italy does not have a Gen Z, Spain does not have a Gen Z. Like a lot of countries are just, it's decline from here on out. And then I think, as you mentioned, like immigration is still a very good source of vitality, right? So even if Latin America is suffering through some decline in fertility and so on, if the least complacent people from everywhere in the world continue to want to move to America and contribute, then that is an enormous asset. And critically, it's one that China doesn't have. Nobody wants to move to China. Nobody can move to China and become Chinese. They will go and you'll experience tremendous racism in China, no matter where you come from. And so I think the U.S., I think it's going to be a drag on growth, the sort of the demographic decline, but I think it's going to be way worse in every other country. So if you're thinking about it in comparative terms, we're in better shape than most. And as you mentioned, if we can increase healthy lifespans, right? If you can solve through the amazing things that are happening in biology today in terms of figuring out these different signals within the cell and what they signal in terms of repair versus aging and so on, we could extend healthy lifespan quite a bit, including working lifespan and so on, and that could be another source of not becoming a state where half the population is retired, which is what we want to avoid.
I largely agree with Eli. The United States is one of the only countries that will be significantly larger in 2100 than it is today. You have places like Korea that will literally be, South Korea, that will literally be half the size of what they are today, which is mind-boggling and obviously much, much older at that same time. The United States did have above replacement level fertility, unlike most of Western Europe and the developed world, from about 1980 till 2008. And it dropped very substantially since then. We're about 1.6 kids per woman now. But the fact that we had that so high and that that was not so long ago makes me fairly optimistic that we can put it back there. And we obviously continue to be a destination for people all around the world. And so when you look at even places like Brazil and South Korea and elsewhere that are we're going to see substantial population declines, and U.S. continuing to grow continuously. It makes us, like in so many examples, we're the tallest pygmy. Like we do terribly on all these measures, but we keep doing better than everyone else. So,
I forgot to say, I should add, that if we address a lot of the issues that we've talked about on this panel today, I think that could create a rebound in fertility, right? If housing was cheap, right? If healthcare was cheaper because through innovation, if energy became too cheap to meter, or we had even other expenses like transportation, like you could. If living costs are low, then it becomes a lot cheaper to have kids, right? What you have to give up to do it is less, and that is that's an incredible driver of fertility.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this panel, though I believe both our panelists will be sticking around so you can ask any further questions or make any further comments offline. We have a 15-minute break, I believe, until the next panel, but please join me in thanking Judge and Eli for this very interesting discussion.
Welcome to Stakeholder Capitalism versus Shareholder Rights, How ESG Undermines American Prosperity. I'm Allison Schrager, and I'm a senior fellow here at Manhattan Institute, and I'm joined by Riley Moore, State Treasurer of the state of West Virginia, and Will Hild, Executive Director of Consumer Research. So we're going to talk mostly about ESG investing, which I guess is the close sibling of stakeholder capitalism, or they're very much related. So, for a lot of decades, there has been this whole idea, in the same way what you consume, what you invest in, should it reflect your values? There have been funds that appeal to different religious groups. But it feels like ESG has taken on a very different character in the last decade or so. While this has been a very sort of negligible part of the market, I'd say starting around 2012, 2013, ESG investment funds have just grown exponentially. It could be low rates, it could be the market just grew a lot too, and also that we're seeing them being more broadly marketed, and also more increased popularity, we're going to talk a lot about today, with institutional investors, particularly state pension funds. And even more recently, the Department of Labor has changed its guidance on what a fiduciary is to sort of not be so limited to pecuniary measures like risk and return. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. Maybe that sounds a little vague to you, and we'll discuss what it means to us here, although I gotta be honest, I'm not optimistic. Even with our very sort of qualified, smart, knowledgeable panel on this, you'll have a lot of clarity on that, because the vagueness and the arbitrariness is almost by design. I think the other thing before we get into it that I wanna note about ESG is almost just mathematically, it was marketed as you can do good for the world and also get a high return. And I think that should never really pass the smell test. If you do, as I said, want to invest in something, because it reflects your values, perhaps that's okay. But the idea that you're also going to get a higher return for that is just sort of absurd. Just mathematically, a constrained optimization does not give you the same high value that an unconstrained optimization does, particularly when what your constraint is so vague and changing over time. And I mean, I'm sure you'll probably read in a lot of mainstream publications that, oh yeah, ESG funds outperform the rest of the market. That might have been true, initially when there was some hype around these, but certainly I recommend the work of Aswath Damodaran, who is probably the leading expert on value and stocks, who's finding something quite different. And so he says that he's noticing a shift from claiming that ESG is going to beat the market to it just is a better hedge for risk. What risk? Unclear. Again, the vagueness is sort of the point. So I think it does raise legitimate questions, which we're going to get into today, of, is this something that's appropriate for certainly pension funds, which are backed by taxpayer dollars, or certainly is it appropriate, which isn't an issue now, but certainly could be with the new DOL ruling, of being a default in 401k plans, especially because the arbitrariness necessarily, like anything in the stakeholder model, starts to reflect values. And not everyone has the same values, and I think that's okay. But you shouldn't have other people's values forced on you when you're investing or when you're really doing any sort of consumer activity. So just to jump in, I'd like to ask each of you what ESG you think it means and what your concerns are with it.
Sure. Thank you very much. And you kind of encapsulated that well at the outset of the vagueness of it. I mean, that is part of the point of this. I mean, you can define it based on whatever your objectives happen to be. If you're bought into more of the left-wing ideology, and that's how they decide to define that. But to me, what it is, essentially, ESG is forcing dollars towards ideas instead of returns. That's really kind of what's going on here. It's forcing dollars towards ideas instead of returns. And it's created this unholy merger in between left-wing kind of activists and political ideologues and corporate power to essentially achieve objectives in which they cannot achieve through the democratic process or the ballot box. So that's why these are being pushed through capital markets and financial institutions, because there's no way they can pass this, whether it's in Congress or state legislatures or otherwise. So, and to be frank and honest, unfortunately, it is working. It is absolutely working. For us, for example, in West Virginia, obviously we are a coal state. We're an energy state. We do coal, gas, and oil. A number of the large financial institutions, banks in the country have prohibitions that they state publicly and in writing to lending to the fossil fuel industry, specifically thermal coal. Not based on any type of risk, but based on what they define as risk, which is this climate change nonsense. Now, to me, now look, I can't imagine everybody here is tracking the price of coal every day, but over the last year, I mean, it's been astronomical. You can't tell me that every coal company out there lending money to them is not making money, right? I mean, it's based on this ideology as it relates to climate change, as it relates to social good and human rights, which are defined by them, which is coincidentally very concerned with human rights here in the United States, but then not concerned with it in places like China, where they happen to be heavily invested, which is very interesting in its own. So, in essence, I'd just go back to what I said at the outset. It's having dollars forced towards ideas instead of returns, and we've seen that with these ESG ETFs that are out there. They were all heavily loaded up on tech stocks. Tech stocks went down, and energy stocks skyrocketed. And because of ESG and a lack of diversification within those ETFs, they missed that bounce. And you saw ESG ETFs lose quite a bit of value. And who does that hurt? That hurts your pension beneficiary. That hurts your 401k holder. And list goes on, and it really hammers folks in the working class who don't have any agency to make any of these decisions whatsoever in some defined retirement benefit plan. So, in any event, that is how I would define it.
I think what I would say, and certainly this isn't in any disagreement with the treasurer. ESG is the phenomenon of trying to use the financial service industry to circumvent the ballot box and push far left political agendas. It's not just when you have a fund that says ESG on it. In fact, I would say that of an overall description, or as an overall percentage, I should say, of the ESG phenomenon, funds that actually say ESG in the label are probably a small minority. And certainly, that doesn't apply at all to the banking and the insurance organizations, companies, that we see pushing ESG policies, even though they aren't doing ESG investing. So what is ESG then? It is trying to force companies downstream from the financial service industry to adhere to either net zero targets, to far left social politics. We've seen this with Target, with LGBTQ issues, force them to try and circumvent state laws on abortion restrictions. Anytime you see a financial institutional player doing that, whether it's an asset manager who has a fund that says ESG, or a bank, like we just launched our latest campaigns against the Bank of America, they are putting restrictions on their loan portfolio that require loan recipients to adhere to net zero targets, for example, when it comes to new oil and gas, or loans for oil and gas ventures, or for new, even agriculture is one of the areas in which they're very active. So I would call that ESG as well. When Bank of America says, listen, Mr. Cattle Rancher, in order to give you this loan, you're gonna have to commit to reducing your stock of cattle by X% by X number of years, that is the ESG phenomenon. It's similar to CRT. There are textbooks that are literally critical race theory branded. You can buy them. But any textbook that tells American children that America is an inherently white supremacist society, that's part of the CRT phenomenon. So I would label ESG as a broad phenomenon similarly.
Yeah.
I mean, where do you think this came from? Because I mentioned it used to be a fairly negligible part of the market. And now, I mean, depending on the estimate in 2020, it got up to like $17 trillion. It seemed to really almost come out of nowhere. I mean, what do you account
Well,
for?
I think the genesis of this, right, was, pardon me, this smoke, I think, outside is getting me here a little bit. But you had kind of socially responsible investing, right? So that was kind of the precursor to all of this, where people wanted to invest in different financial products that kind of aligned with their values, and the hope was that that would gain steam and be able to kind of push whatever that specific agenda might be as it's tied to that fund or bank or asset manager, what have you. But what happened was that the dollars continued to follow returns instead of ideas. And so that's where you got into this, what I call coercive capitalism, which that's really what it is, which is ESG, because they're forcing this compliance into this. I mean, if you're a 401k holder out here, does your manager ever ask you, would you like to invest in ESG? I doubt that, but there's a 90% chance if you have a retirement plan out here, you're invested in it. Go ask them. I guarantee you are. So you're not asked that. And then secondarily to that, where the real power is, and this is what they figured out, is proxy voting. So BlackRock, for instance, $10 trillion assets under management. Under management. That's not their money. That's other people's money. And those $10 trillion, they're leveraging votes that are associated with those shares that they have to be able to push their agenda on corporate boards and all the rest, and try to bring uniformity throughout corporate America into their worldview and objective. Larry Fink has said it himself. I mean, we are going to force behavior. He has said that very clearly.
I mean, how much of this growth is due to institutional investors, where, as you say, taxpayers are effectively being forced into it, and how much is, say, retail investors who maybe are just making a choice?
Well, I mean, look, if you're talking about State Street, Vanguard, BlackRock, three biggest asset managers in the world, combined over $20 trillion, close to $25 trillion assets under management. That's larger than the GDP of the United States in a given year. So I think they're going to have a lot of leverage in how they're going to shape the market, rather than just the individual, perhaps investor or activist or something like that. And there's a total coordination in between just 3 entities. That's all that it takes to get on board with this and be able to push these things. And the problem is the amount of assets they have under management, like a BlackRock or Vanguard for that matter, their expense ratios and their expense fees are so low on index funds and ETFs, you're not going to be able to beat that. And so people are going to continue to buy into that because of the expense and the scales of economy there, which they have at their disposal.
So, well, can you tell me a bit about, what you're doing to push back?
Yeah, certainly. So to your question about how this got so large, really the reason is they weren't being very explicit with their customers about how exactly they were using their dollars. Vast majority of people, when we launched our multi-million-dollar ad campaigns to educate consumers about BlackRock and what they were doing, our polling had them at about 14% of people said that even claimed to know what BlackRock was or did, and only about half that could correctly pick it out of a multiple choice test. So the vast majority of Americans had absolutely no idea who BlackRock was, even though, as the treasurer noted, they're the most powerful company in the world by, I think, any reasonable measure. And the reason for that is, as I said before, the ESG fund portion of their assets under management is tiny in terms of the part that's explicit. But what BlackRock chose to do is to take all of their funds and use them to vote, again, as the treasurer noted, to push these ESG priorities regardless of what fund you were in. So if you, for example, the iShares S&P 500 index fund is probably the most vanilla investment you could buy. You're just buying basically a broad swath of the entire market. If you own the BlackRock iShares fund, you are in an ESG fund. They walk into corporate boardrooms across the country and they use the shares in that fund that they bought with your money to push ESG objectives. So it's not just, you asked how this got so big. The reason is, while it started out as this explicit acronym where they're going to put it on a label, they then simply moved those priorities into their entire assets under management. And effectively, if you are invested with those 3 companies, you are invested in, and all of your money is now invested in an ESG fund. And that was part of how they grew it. And part of why we launched our campaign is because once people realize this, they feel cheated and defrauded and understand the ways in which they're seeing the retail-facing companies that are supposed to serve them suddenly serving this woke agenda. And that's really, we didn't want them to get away with what they were doing by virtue of their obscurity. And so we launched our ongoing campaign against them.
So you're saying that sort of the big asset managers are pushing ESG values really on all companies, whether or not it's part of a fund that's part of ESG. So it's
correct. And we talked. We're obviously, the name of this panel is kind of defending shareholder primacy. I will actually defend the precursor to this a little bit. When people, I'm a son of a Southern Baptist minister, and I'm ashamed to say that. Well, actually, I'm not that ashamed to say the Southern Baptists are who pioneered this. The social responsible investing was one of the big things that the Catholics and the Baptists, one of the few things we agree on theologically. They wanted to get their money out of things that they felt were vice. So they divested of things like alcohol sales, pornography, gambling. But the difference there is twofold, and you hit on this a little bit. One, their investment managers were very explicit with them, and they asked them to be. This is going to hurt your returns. Okay, our pension funds are going to lose money that we could have otherwise gained because we just, by dint of not having as diversified a portfolio. And they took that risk on themselves. The second thing is that they didn't go into companies that were doing what they were supposed to be doing, or at least established in doing, and try to change that, okay, and drag with them all of the other shareholders who are along for the ride. They didn't go to Wynn Casinos and say, turn yourself into a church or something like that. They simply divested of Wynn Casinos. The difference with what ESG does the vast majority of it doesn't change. When you invest in an ESG fund, they don't change the asset allocations. There's no difference between an ESG fund 90% of the time and a regular iShare, S&P 500 or other index fund. The only difference is that they're going into a company like Exxon and they're dragging that company away from focusing on its consumers and what it's supposed to be doing, both to the detriment of the consumers, but also to all the other shareholders. You buy into Exxon and you find out, oh, actually Larry is telling them to go, Larry Fink is telling them to go run around, building windmills, right? That's not shareholder primacy. So I forget exactly where I was going with this, but to wrap up, I do think that the shift there is a very important difference in that they are trying to change the way every business operates rather than simply allocate capital towards new or existing business they think will do better over time.
Well, I'll say, as a Catholic, we agree on a couple things because we're on this panel together. So.
That's right.
So, what are you doing to push back? You're actually, have control over money.
Yeah, we've done a number of things in the state of West Virginia. So, this was in 2021. We started a coalition of about 15 states around the country. Wrote President Biden and major financial institutions, letting them know if they were not going to change some of the practices that they had in place as it relates to the fossil fuel industry, that we were going to start to change our banking contracts and start to look other places. Well, they didn't respond to that at all, and so then I followed up in January of 2022, and I was the first elected official in the country to divest from BlackRock $1.5 billion. And so then we went somewhere else, and then after that, we went to the legislature and asked for authority to create what's called the Restricted Financial Institution List, and which essentially says if you are boycotting the fossil fuel industry, which is obviously a huge part of our economy, you will no longer be eligible for contracts with the state government of West Virginia or its municipalities, and if you have a current contract, it will be canceled. And so we ended up sending out 6 letters to BlackRock, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs, and U.S. Bank. And of those 6, we put 5 of them on the restricted financial institution list. U.S. Bank, this is great, actually reversed their lending policy. So they took away their prohibition on lending to thermal coal, natural gas pipeline construction, as well as certain types of oil exploration projects. So that was a huge win for us. On the other side, we had to terminate contracts with those other financial institutions other than BlackRock, which we had already dropped. And just to be clear here, I'm doing this not as a market regulator. I'm a state treasurer. I don't regulate the market. I don't sit over here at U.S. Treasury. I'm the state treasurer of West Virginia. So I'm acting as a market participant, right? And all I'm doing is stating my preferences in the marketplace and putting those preferences out there and saying, here's who we'd like to contract with. Because we had a clear conflict of interest there, where if I'm contracting with, say, JP Morgan and their stated goal is to eliminate coal, and I just got $500 million worth of tax revenue from coal, that's a problem, right? So for them to manage those dollars. And so then we did that. Sorry, I got a couple others. And this was an interesting one. It's off the fossil fuel thing, but there was an issue with merchant category codes and credit card companies tracking the purchase of guns and ammunition around the country. We introduced legislation which passed in the legislature this year on that. And what we did was create a cause of action there if credit card companies or financial institutions shared that information. And Visa and MasterCard, citing our legislation, actually backed off of that policy and paused that, not just in West Virginia, but in the United States. So we were really happy to see that kind of rolled back. And what this is, it's a backdoor national gun registry. It goes back to Will's point and what I said earlier of trying to achieve things through the financial markets that you can't at the ballot box. They were going to use that data, and this was pushed by Elizabeth Warren and others, to have financial institutions start to flag what they deem as suspicious activity as it relates to purchases of guns and ammunition. That is not their job. That's the government's job. So we were able to certainly get a win there. And the last one, because we talked about it, proxy voting, we're one of the first states to pass a proxy voting bill in West Virginia. So our state pension funds, which I'm a trustee of, will no longer, our proxy votes can no longer be cast for any ESG vote on any of the securities that we hold. And over the 15,000 votes that we cast in a year, they are only going to be cast for pecuniary interests. If you're familiar with that term, essentially financial and material risk or return is how those votes are going to be cast, right? We're trying to vote in a way that's maximizing shareholder value and not maximizing some type of political objective or goal.
So financial institutions aren't known for being completely, wanting to get involved and align themselves with one particular party. And the growth of ESG happened during a Republican administration. I mean, why is Larry Fink so attracted to this?
Well, you love talking about this guy about as much as I do, and I just spoke for a while. So.
Okay. Well, that is a great question, and I think there are certainly different motivations for different players within the game. Part of why you saw some run up in ESG, you noted that some of the fee structures are a little different for ESG funds. I think that was part of the rush for every asset manager to have some sort of ESG option. As active management has declined and passive management, cheaper, lower expense ratio, passive vehicles have risen in popularity, Wall Street has been fiending for sort of reasons to raise those rates back up. And ESG is a good gimmick to tell people that you're doing some sort of fancy scoring and then jack up the fee ratios, sometimes as high as 500-600% of what the equivalent index would be. So, depending on what you're comparing it to, the ESG version of the S&P 500 might be a 40 basis points versus 10 or even free for some of the major asset managers. So that was part of it. Part of it is greed. That said, I think there is also, unfortunately, just like those who follow, like the previous panel, who follow the rise in government regulation have noted that there's often a revolving door between regulators and the industries that they work in, so that they kind of like they go into regulation so that they can then get a cool job, and then they get the cool job so they can go and be important in government. I think we're seeing that, but it's just a very higher level. Larry Fink was rumored to had Hillary Clinton won the presidency, would have been Treasury Secretary most likely. It was kind of
Thank God that didn't happen.
Exactly, and we see that play out. They get a lot of quid pro quo favors when they do this type of thing. And I think it is important to note one thing we didn't get into the granularity of it, but you asked kind of where ESG came from. I do think it's important to note ESG was actually invented in an office of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. Paul Clement Hunt, not the lawyer, but the UN bureaucrat that no one had ever heard of, invented it in 2005. And germane to, the title of this panel, he even noted in an interview that it was constructed specifically to hack the Friedmanite view of shareholder primacy. He saw what us good Baptists and you Catholics had done with social responsible investing, and he thought, how can we take that and turn it into something that can give us an excuse under the Friedmanite doctrine, which thankfully is preeminent, to inject, to put in our political agenda as a wedge issue. And so this UN has been the organizer of a lot of this stuff. In fact, the largest net zero organization, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, that has the Net Zero Banking Alliance, that has the Net Zero Insurers Alliance, or at least it did till it collapsed 3 weeks ago, and the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance. Those are all run out of the UN. And in fact, the banks invited in the net zero banking subsidiary of GFANZ, they agreed not only to use their portfolio to push net zero targets, they agreed to have the United Nations audit them in accordance with living up to their promises. So to your point as well, Treasurer, about we can't really think of this as something that markets have chosen to do organically. There is it's almost hard to overstate the involvement of government in the rise of this. And so we're pushing back, because I'm not saying we abandon free market principles or try to push in a way that just injects our views on the market. But we need to understand what we're up against, and this is not an organic phenomenon. This is a government phenomenon.
Yeah, and to that point, I'd say that's what is very important here. We're trying to ensure that the free market remains free. That's what we're trying to do here, because in a word, what this comes down to is control. That's what this is about. This is about control. It's command and control economics from the top down that has been cooked up by left-wing ideologues and government bureaucrats. And it is about control, about how we use energy, what we consume, what we teach our kids, all of these things. It's just another form of control, and this will ultimately, I think, be one of the biggest hindrances, if not bring down the capitalist system, because of what we've been talking about, and you've heard here, is a lack of diversification. A lack of diversification. And this is going to destroy people's potential retirement moving down the road, and it's going to potentially also harm large financial institutions as well, which would be of their own making.
Yeah, I just want an amusing story I read yesterday, or I don't know if it's amusing or sad, is a German, did you see this, that one of the states in Germany has declared U.S. treasuries aren't ESG compliant? Because we're not following some UN directive.
Wow, that's...
So, I mean, I'm wondering, where we hope this goes. My own personal evolution on this, my first thought was with ESG as well. It doesn't really belong in state pension funds. It certainly does not belong in 401k plans because, it's not like they have enough money to begin with. We can really afford lower returns. But I was like, is it the worst thing if BlackRock essentially is the role of, say, the Catholic Church 1,000 years ago, where people, pay high fees and accept lower returns so they can feel better about themselves? But now I'm starting to really come around now that it might actually really be a cancer on the economy. So do you think there's a world where we could just sort of have ESG for retail investors and they do it if they want? Or does this really just have to be excised?
I think it needs to be excised, but I think ESG funds, can exist, but must be disclosed. Mm-hmm. That's the problem here, is that the lack of transparency and disclosure. Look, you got a rule that they're working on right now at the SEC that's going to enable these asset managers to not disclose the amount of ESG that happens to be in a certain financial instrument. That's a problem, right? That's something that we have to fight back against. There's a lack of transparency, and they're trying to make it more and more opaque, this entire process. So for me, yeah, look, can it exist? Sure, it can exist. And I do want to make this very clear. I think, as Republicans, my party, there are some, we have to resist this idea of also, well, why don't we do a Republican ESG? That's a terrible idea, too. This is all a terrible, either side of it is a bad idea. We just need, look, if there's a solar company making money, go invest in it. If there's a coal company making money, go invest in it. Let dollars flow towards things that are going to maximize shareholder return and dollars for the pension beneficiaries. That's how money needs to flow.
Yeah, we're a non-paternalistic consumer protection organization. We're actually the oldest in the country. So we don't say that people shouldn't be allowed to put their investment dollars behind the values that they want. But to the Treasurer's point, absolutely, it needs to be disclosed. And it just has no business in government investing. That needs to be neutral, value neutral, so that people don't feel like people living in Alabama and Florida don't feel like their money's being used to undermine their political interests. I would just add that I think it will be excised. I think it has to be. And to give some people, we've obviously talked about a lot of bad, negative consequences and huge asset managers and banks and insurers. So sort of like, okay, great, it's bad. What hope do we have? I think that we should actually leave here, and especially at this point in the fight, feeling very empowered. Consumers over the last few months have given black eyes to two major corporations in the form of Target and Anheuser-Busch. One state, the Treasurer is being very humble here, one state's legislation killed that gun registry. They were explicit about that. because they were worried about the liability. Because of the way a national economy has to work, you can't have a ton of friction across borders. But thankfully, we live in a federalist system, and people the states have the rights to pass their own laws and how they're going to operate within. And so the moment you have states standing up, as they should, and say, no, you're not going to create a national gun registry in our state. You're not going to use our state's pension money the way that California's pension funds tell you to, because that's part of what's happening, by the way. CalSTRS and CalPERS won't do business with an asset manager that won't agree to use Texas's pension funds or Florida's pension funds or any other money to their political means. The moment you start to stand up and object to that, their entire framework falls apart. Just a few weeks, I made a reference, this net zero insurers alliance that was part of this GFANS complex, got a letter from 13 state attorneys general saying, based on your website, based on the paperwork that your CEOs physically signed, it looks like you're engaged in a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It looks like you guys are getting together and fixing the supply of goods or services in the market. Can you explain that? Within 3 weeks, half the members of this group, including its chairman of AXA Insurance, had left citing the legal risk. So luckily, they have built a very impressive house of cards, and state leaders like Treasurer Moore here and others are standing up, and it's really falling apart. So not only do I think it must be excised, I think it is being excised.
So we've reached peak ESG.
I think so.
God willing.
Yes, I think so. I think we're probably in the third or fourth inning of this fight because the amount of people who now you asked why, I should have said this, why is someone like Larry Fink doing this? The interview you referenced when he was being interviewed by DealBook, he's up there with Andrew Ross Sorkin, talking about how he throws his weight around and he forces behaviors. It's kind of like that scene in Big Short, which I imagine most of you folks have probably seen, where Steve Carell's character is asking one of his buddies, why is this guy confessing to me about all the shenanigans he's pulling? He's not confessing, he's bragging. In 2017, Larry Fink got to walk around, and these CEOs got to walk around like they were more important than the President of the United States. And that's very intoxicating. And they're not going to let go of that easily. They're very invested in that personally at this point. But I do think we have reached peak ESG.
And I think it's important to note, though, also Vanguard getting out of the International Asset Managers Alliance. Vanguard, look, that's second biggest asset manager, assets under management. There was a net zero asset managers alliance, and Vanguard left. I mean, that is a big deal. That's a very big deal. $7 trillion. That is look. It's slow. It's keeps moving. Unfortunately, President Biden over here vetoed Congressman Andy Barr's bill over there. But look, that's kind of the next step in this process. I mean, there needs to be something that's done on the federal level.
All right, so we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Does anybody have any?
One of the strange phenomena, at least strange to me, in the financial world is the role of these institutional shareholder advisors. There are only 2 of them. As far as I know, a lot of pension funds use them to shape their votes on various measures. And I believe it's the case that they are fully bought into the ESG agenda. Is there anything we can do to sort of hold them accountable in some way to get them off that case?
Yeah, you're talking about ISS and Glass Lewis. They represent about 94% of all the proxy advisory services that are in the United States, both of which those companies, by the way, are not even based in the United States, I would also add. But in any event, so for us, in Florida, the same way. So Florida was using ISS. We were using ISS in West Virginia. We passed this proxy voting bill where ISS, if they want to contract with us, they're going to have to comply with that. They're going to have to comply with our law and our standard if they want to keep that contract, or we're going to find another proxy advisor. And the problem is you have so many votes, right, that you're talking about. West Virginia, it's 15,000 votes. We're a small state. In Florida, they're talking 100,000 proxy votes cast in a year. A lot of that, though, is just your day-to-day votes that are not really that controversial, which can sometimes run automated. And ISS actually came up with an automated system at the request of the state of Florida to start to handle some of those votes. And then the more controversial ones, they're taking instruction, the managers are, on how those are going to be cast. Now, that's what we're looking to do in West Virginia as well, since we passed this proxy voting bill. But look, there are some new market entrants. One of them is running for president now, Strive Asset Managers. They're out there. They have proxy advisors firms. Second Vote Advisors is another one. So there has been some new market entrants here as well. But the amount of times like a BlackRock votes with ISS, I mean, like here's the recommendation. And I mean, not even BlackRock can in-house all their proxy votes. It's just too many. And they use them as well. So, I mean, but that's usually, if you see what they put out, it is same kind of thing. Net zero, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. These are their stated objectives in terms of the vote recommendations that they're going to make. And 80 to 85% of the time, these asset managers are just taking that recommendation. So that's why taking away the proxy vote power is so important. And you've seen BlackRock, who recently just brought on sorry to get too far in the weeds here, but what's called proxy choice voting, right? So they're index funds, which are made up of, the whole S&P 500, like an iShare. You're not going to be able to like pull out each one of those, like, okay, Exxon, I vote this way, and Apple, I vote that way. What they're going to, and so those votes were given to BlackRock and contracted over with them. But what they're going to do now is offer proxy choice voting, where they will take instruction from a pension fund like in West Virginia and say, here's how we would like our shares to be cast. So they do see that there are problems on the horizon for them, and they're trying to even adjust. Even BlackRock is.
Yeah, it's absolutely a great point about it's another category of financial services that need to be wrangled. I think it's a two-layer solution. At the state level, the things that folks like the treasurer are doing, you've seen the Texas, actually the legislature of Texas held hearings swear upon the Bible, like threat of perjury, called in ISS for having messed up a number of votes where they actually used Texas retirement system assets to vote for shareholder proposals that condemned the state of Texas by name, namely around the abortion issue. And I think they seem to be getting the message at some level. ISS, last year, there were 3 pro-choice shareholder proposals, TJ Maxx, Lowe's, and Walmart. ISS advised advised to vote for those proposals, and I think they got somewhere around 35% support on average. This year, there was pretty much the identical proposal came before was on the Coca-Cola proxy, and ISS changed their tune and advised to vote against it. Now, I think that raises questions as to whether which time were you violating your fiduciary duty to the state, given that it was the same proposal that you changed your mind about. But I do think it suggests that they're starting to get the pressure and understand that the states have had it. That said, to your point about the market concentration, people like Bob Borg Jr., who's not exactly known for seeing antitrust violations everywhere, given who his daddy was, and the consumer welfare standard that he works to help defend, has said this looks like a duopoly that the FTC should probably look at. And the fact that, as the treasurer noted, both of them are foreign-owned. ISS is owned by the German stock exchange. Glass Lewis is owned by an offshoot, a bunch of bureaucrats from the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, bought it from the Teachers Pension Fund. So this is, it's like obviously a political maneuver. So you have 2 companies controlling, depending on the company, somewhere between 10 and 30% of the votes of the shares outstanding of a company, and they're both foreign-owned, and specifically Germany and Canada, which both are farther out on the net zero. They both benefit, basically, from us hamstringing ourselves, particularly in the form of energy. So I do think at the federal level, this is very much ripe for investigation and examination and oversight, either by the FTC or by even Congress, which you're starting to see, House Oversight Committee look at.
I think we have time for one more question. I'll leave it to you to decide.
Thank you, all three of you, for the discussion. I'd want to ask you to take a skeptical look at the assertion that we're at peak ESG. Gary Gensler at the Securities and Exchange Commission has a draft rule that, by many accounts, is the most expensive proposed rule in the history of America, or none. If that's the case, and as many legal scholars and practitioners in the field of financial regulation look at it, there's no underlying statutory authority for that proposed rule. The SEC doesn't have that job. How much harm can be done while we wait for the rule to get out, the courts to review it, the rule to be repealed, et cetera? How much harm is in front of us from an ESG movement that is still losing steam? As you note, GFANS is coming undone. The insurance network is coming undone. States' attorneys general are being more aggressive. States like West Virginia have taken a leadership role. What's the danger on the horizon yet?
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, it's like with anything as it relates to rules and regulation, is that industry, right, they're going to start to comply. And then to get to a point to unwind that then becomes so onerous and expensive that they've already moved into a state of compliance, then yeah, that is a problem. Now, I know my attorney general and I know other attorney generals around the country, I mean, like, they're not going to stand for this. But to your point, while we sit around and wait and this thing gets decided in some court, how much damage can be done? Yeah, I mean, it's concerning. It's certainly concerning for a state like West Virginia. I mean, we're really worried about it. You know, at some point, you know, for us, I mean, the state's been doing great here lately, but particularly as it relates to our industries, I mean, we're going to be faced with, you know, maybe perhaps we just don't comply with some of this. And, you know, they can try to take us to court, you know, I mean, or we're throwing, I mean, our futures away, right? I mean, it's just so much pressure and regulation coming down from the federal government on us from all different angles. I mean, it is certainly, yeah, it's concerning. But I think what Will's group has done, and people all over the country now, people have really awakened to this issue. I mean, it was, when I divested and dropped BlackRock, and this was 2 years ago, people are looking at me like I was wearing a tinfoil hat. They were like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what? I don't even know what this is. You mentioned ESG now, and people get it. We're sitting here at the Manhattan Institute like on a panel talking about it. I mean, I think there's going to be, people are just waiting to pounce on something like this. I know my attorney general is. So, Will, you have any?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It kind of goes to the question, one of the questions from the last panel is, there's always this ratcheting effect, right? The left gets 2 steps forward, then we push them back a step, but the overall trend is obviously has been in their direction. I think that gets, to your point, what's going to happen is people are going to have to staff up to conform to this new regulation, even while it's still being litigated. And the question is, assuming we win and it gets thrown out, what happens to the companies' departments that have been set up for this? Then there's going to be a constituency. We like to think, you know, we live in this world where, yeah, the CEO at the top of the company looks like he goes, this department, I literally don't need it anymore. Like, I have a Supreme Court ruling that says so. I'm just going to like cut all these people loose. What we've seen is it's not really, you know, how many useless tech employees did we find out once the interest rates environment changed, had been basically been doing nothing for like 10 years and just soaking up profits at companies that weren't even turning a profit, right? So I do think, one, we have to have a culture that is a little bit, I hate to say like more bare knuckle or more ruthless in that sense, but we're going to have to push companies. I think it's incumbent upon, unfortunately, consumers at this point to push these companies to say, listen, you don't need a DEI department. It doesn't deliver anything to your bottom line. All it does is distract you from who you're supposed to be serving, which is me, the consumer, right? Having a DEI department should be a mark against a company in the eyes of consumers. Having a department to like calculate their Fugazi numbers on CO2 emissions should be a mark against a company and the consumers, because by definition, that's money that either could have gone in the shareholder's pocket or as a consumer protection advocate, lowering the cost of the goods and services that are being provided. That should be the focus of the CEO. He's either putting a dollar in the pocket of his shareholders or a dollar keeping it in the pocket of his consumers. And any employee departments that don't actually do anything should be aggressively attacked. And I will only push back slightly. I agree. We don't need a conservative ESG in the sense of like a investment, where we try and get, big corporations to give to United for Life or something like that.
Right, that's kind of my point. Like,
Right.
we're going to have only ETFs that we do Second Amendment and pro-life and this.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think what we do need is an activated shareholder class that looks very skeptically at CEOs who don't cut dead weight, especially as it pertains to DEI departments and this kind of nonsense climate disclosure. So that, God willing, when we this gets tossed for being insane, there will be a shedding of all this nonsense. But I agree, it is an issue we're going to have to deal with and keep an eye on.
Yes, that's unfortunately all that we have time for. So we're going to take a quick break, and promptly at 4, please be in your seat for Senator McConnell.
It is my great honor to introduce our next speaker, one of America's most powerful, respected, and accomplished public servants, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. Known for his fierce devotion to the Constitution and his knack for getting big things done, even under divided government, Senator McConnell has represented Kentucky in the U.S. Senate since 1985, and he has served as Republican leader since 2007, thus making him the longest-serving Senate party leader in history. Please join me in welcoming Senator Mitch McConnell to the stage.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the kind introduction. And I might say it's hard to believe it's been 4 years since you took over. And thank you for your unique and invaluable contribution. For 45 years, from school choice to welfare to work to public safety and policing to legal reform, MI and City Journal have punched far above your weight. You shaped conservative ideas and you changed policy outcomes for the better. I've been a fan of your work and a consumer of your research for a long time. So I'm gratified to see MI continuing to thrive and expand your impact in this exciting new chapter. So thanks for your outstanding work and for the opportunity to be here today. I have a distinct role as Senate Party Leader. Frequently asked, what's it like? And my answer is, it's a little bit like being the groundskeeper at a cemetery. Everybody's under you, but nobody's listening. My role lends itself to a perspective that's less philosophical and top-down and more incremental and bottom-up. Our party is obviously a big tent. I've got everybody from Lisa Murkowski to Ted Cruz. Our Senate conference have a few who are quite libertarian. We have a couple of members who are pretty populist, and we have a whole spectrum of viewpoints that are all clearly right of center. But we're united in the big things. We stand for fiscal sanity, against the reckless liberal spending on pet priorities that elites dream up in places like Brooklyn and San Francisco. We stand for smartly and soberly waging our competition with China that will define the next century. And we stand against the socialist misunderstanding that job creators and American workers are bitter rivals in a zero-sum game. Because the truth is, nations can grow and work and innovate their way to prosperity, but they can't redistribute their way to prosperity. So I don't see today's question about the future of conservative economics as a single top-down decision. I don't see this as one abstract question that gets answered actually one way or the other. Instead, I see the evolving product of dozens of smart and talented Republican senators applying their expertise to our most pressing issues. So let me just mention a sampling. The first example, I would mention Energy and Natural Resources Committee. The chair is John Barrasso. And the top Republican on Environment and Public Works, Shelley Moore Capito, introduced a combined effort to overhaul the broken permitting and environmental review process that are holding back infrastructure projects all over our country. Their bills, the SPUR Act and the Restart Act, would go a long way to slash the red tape and get our country making things and building things once again. We built the Empire State Building in 13 months. The entire Transcontinental Railroad took less than 6 years. Now it takes that long just to pull your permits and get your environmental impact statements. Senate Republicans want to do something about that. Another great example is the Employee Rights Act, steered by my friend from South Carolina, Senator Tim Scott. It would loosen the stranglehold that big labor and Democrats have on the American workforce. If we want to create 21st century jobs and outcompete China, we need the future of work in America to be determined by workers and job creators, not big labor bosses. I could do this all day, but here's one more. We all know that a huge millstone around the neck of American competitiveness is our tangled tax structure. Well, take a look at the IRS Funding Accountability Act from Senators Thune, Grassley, and Cassidy, and the Align Act from Senator Langford on expensing capital investments, and Senator Young's American Innovation and Jobs Act to up our game on R&D through tax credits instead of DC micromanagement. Now, at this particular juncture, it's the Democratic leader and not me who has the ability to set the agenda. I mean, that's the real power that comes from being in the majority. And just to refresh your memory, I made the decision not to fill the Scalia vacancy when he passed away. So regardless of whether within the two parties you have lots of different points of view, controlling the agenda is where the power lies. And right now, Schumer controls the agenda. As I often tell people, I've been the majority leader, I've been the minority leader. Majority better. So the Senate is not likely to be an assembly line for strong conservative reforms. Maybe that'll change in a year and a half. In the meantime, we're making heavy use of one tool the minority does have to force floor action and take big bites out of this administration, stifling overreach, the Congressional Review Act, or CRA. What CRA does is let members of Congress target specific corners of the federal regulatory state and force a privileged vote on whether to rip out a rule or regulation and salt the earth where it used to be planted. We used the CRA during the time that President Trump was president to cancel 17 Obama rules. And we've gotten deeply reacquainted once again under President Biden, but of course, even if we pass them, he will veto them. Senator Sullivan took a stab at infrastructure permitting. Senator Fisher took aim at vehicle emission standards. Senators Mullen, Lummis, and Marshall all made progress rolling back runaway environmental regulations. Believe it or not, a bipartisan majority of the Senate agrees that creatures called the, listen to this, the lesser prairie chicken and the long-eared bat should not be given veto power over the entire economies of several different states. There's another subject that unifies the whole conservative coalition: the rule of law, the judiciary, the concept that the American people deserve a judicial branch that understands that our laws and our Constitution say what they mean and mean what they say. Some people hear about the judiciary and jump immediately to social issues. But I know you don't need me to tell you that predictability, rule of law, and constitutional governance are hugely important preconditions for prosperity and American enterprise. From 2017 to 2021, the Republican Senate achieved a generational change in our courts. 3 Supreme Court justices, 54 new circuit judges, more than 230 Article III judges altogether, brilliant and young men and women who understand the job of judge is actually follow the law. Already the courts are rebuilding proper constitutional guardrails and reining in anti-market ideologues in big government and big labor who seek to go beyond the law. Back in 2018, in the first term with Justice Gorsuch, we got Janus versus ASME, the historic ruling about mandatory public sector union dues, and Lucia versus SEC, which said federal agencies can't predict to be their own judges. So, in the last year's blockbuster West Virginia versus EPA, along with Sackett, ruling from just a couple of weeks ago, the justices sided with the Constitution and ordinary Americans against a runaway EPA that has been running around acting like legislature that nobody elected. And this, my friends, is just the start. The justices recently agreed to hear a new case that might finally drive a stake through the 40-year-old mistake called Chevron deference and remind unelected federal bureaucrats that they work for Congress and the American people, not the other way around. Now, I can't discuss the rule of law at a Manhattan Institute event without mentioning public safety and policing. Your institution has spent decades in the trenches as an unapologetic and fact-based defender of security on our streets and safety in our communities. There are a whole lot of elected officials and activists across the country who sorely need to reread some of James Q. Wilson, start mending some broken windows, and stop hurting innocent citizens with this radical experiment in soft on crime. And of course, this united issue for center-right coalition also has a major economic impact. Just ask the retailers who are pleading for elected officials to stem their losses. Look at productivity in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. The same left that talks constantly about revitalizing distressed neighborhoods could hardly seem less interested in rebuilding the foundation of public safety that would actually let that happen. So let me close with one more observation. Our party and our movement are having vibrant discussions among ourselves about the best ways to apply our timeless principles to today's timely problems. The party of Lincoln and of Reagan is a practical, common sense party that grapples with big questions before our country. What's the best way to outcompete China and protect vital supply chains without descending into protectionism that would stifle the very dynamism we need to win the future? How do we continue to fight Washington overreach and maintain our conservative skepticism of runaway regulators while also not ceding our own power as lawmakers to left-wing forces in corporate America that sometimes want to govern citizens' lives without ever having won an election? These, my friends, are the discussions that need to continue. They're the big questions before all of us. All of us in the arena will keep sorting this out with prudence and practical thinking. One vote, one amendment, and one bill at a time. One debate, one think tank conference, and one white paper at a time. Because we are the coalition with the ideas and the principles that can set our country up to dominate the next century. So thank you all for your important work. It's been a great pleasure to be here today. Let's keep it up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and welcome you to the final panel of this afternoon. The panel is titled Back to Basics, Restoring Fiscal Discipline and Sound Money. My name is Judge Glock. I'm the Director of Research at the Manhattan Institute, and I'm joined with probably two of the best experts in the country to discuss these two issues. First, on the far right is Tom Hoenig, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Mercatus Center and former central banker, although I'm sure nobody will hold that against him, and Brian Riedl, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So I'll start off. After the discussion about the degradation of money, which I know is a particular concern of yours, Tom's, what do you think fundamentally changed post-2008, besides the obvious? We were in the midst of a crisis, but we've hit crises before. Why 2008 do we have sort of an unprecedented response to this crisis, and why, despite your most fervent efforts to counter it, did we have kind of a permanent expansion in the ambit and the scope of the Federal Reserve? Or you could also, maybe the why is a tougher question. You can start off with the how, and if you want to answer the why, you can go on to that.
Well, first of all, let me give some context to why I objected to it so much, because that'll give you a little bit more of the forward answer. But I was one of those individuals who was around in the 70s, and I was in central banking, but and was trained as an economist, but I was in the banking supervision business and watched the inflation build over that period in assets as well as prices. And so when you came to the end of that period and finally inflation got, the goods of services got to 14%, and Volcker came in, raised rates to 20%, asset values just collapsed. And there was a whole ecosystem in banking and in the commercial real estate business, in the land business, in the, you name it, centered around very accommodative real rates, and suddenly that was changed, and rates and the bubble collapsed. And it wasn't just a bubble in a particular asset class, it was across the economy. And the suffering and the consequences of that to the economy, to individuals, to industries, to the system itself was really, I think, put to the test. We had the S&L crisis. You can name every crisis. So I have that experience, and I was involved in really shutting down dozens and dozens of banks. and all the agony of that and all the losses. So here we come to the lead up to 2008, because Volcker ended the inflation. Then we came to the dot-com bubble, and the Fed began to lower interest rates again to address, like Paul said, the Asian financial crisis, the Russian crisis, the other bubbles, and we lowered interest rates. And by 2003, we'd lowered interest rates back to 1%. Again, very asset-wise, bringing back inflation. People were taking the equity out of their homes until we got to 2007 and 8, and we had another crisis. And again, the Fed stepped in. It stepped in every case, stepped in again. Here we are. We're going to take care of it. And I agreed with that. I voted in favor of that. But what I found unbelievable was having all that experience of the 70s and post. When we got to 2010, the Federal Reserve decided to do a new concept, technically, of quantitative easing. And I was just dumbstruck by it. And my arguments were, I've seen this movie before. You know, we're going to use all this money. We're going to put it into the economy. And I did understand and strongly believe that inflation was more than goods and services. It was asset inflation. And that we would spark asset inflation and speculative activities, and that was the intention of doing it. And we would be successful, and we did. We increased speculative activities. Asset values began to increase, again, very substantially. And it took a while for other kinds of inflation going forward. But as I looked at this, and as I experienced this, in the third quarter of 2009, the economy started to recover. And we're now into 2010, and the economy is recovering. But unemployment was still high, and there was this desire to bring it down more quickly, and quantitative easing was the method to do that. So we're going to pump lots of money in, we're going to suppress interest rates to zero, we're going to stimulate activities, and that's basically what we went about doing. So what happened after 2009 was quantitative easing, the printing of mass amounts of money, became a policy tool. It wasn't just a one-time liquidity crisis, do it, it was a tool. And they proved that as they went through from 2010 to 2011, quantitative easing 2, quantitative easing 3. And so we get to 2019, before the pandemic, and there is a repo blip. Interest rates on repos suddenly shoot up. And what does the Fed do? It doesn't say, take your losses. Yep, you're in the business. That's the game. It came in quantitative easing again. And at $60 billion per month, after all this experience, all this time, $60 billion per month, the tool was put to use again. We get to the pandemic. I understand the supply side, but we also then, as Paul said, doubled down, $120 billion per month. The recovery started actually in July, but in August it was clearly in place, and there was no adjustment to the policy. $120 billion per month through all of 2020 into 2021, and only began to slow down a little bit in the first quarter of 2022. So we have pumped all this money into the system, all this inflation, asset inflation, and then finally, goods and services inflation. And what's the effect? 9% inflation. You have now set an entire economic system over that decade and a half, an entire economic system around an equilibrium rate of 0. You cannot change that without severe consequences. And we're only beginning to see those consequences. We saw a mini banking crisis, but remember, that crisis was based on the value of government and government-guaranteed securities under duration risk. That's 25% max of the assets on the balance of banking balance sheets of 23 trillion. So now you still have all the other assets that are under pressure as interest rates have risen, And how are we going to deal with that? Well, we still have a lot of liquidity in there, as we were talking about, as I was talking about with earlier, that is still coming out, but that's eventually going to come out. And if we get into another crisis mode, and that's a real possibility if we have a recession, quantitative easing is the tool that I think will be used. And I don't think the central banks of the world and the central bank of the United States will be able to say, no, you're going to take this very difficult hit again, as was done in 1980, 81, 82. They're going to come in and bail out the system again. Back to zero interest rates, I think it's a high probability. And the reason I think it's a high probability is that's the policy that has been systematically followed for the last 15 years. So that's my concern going forward.
So two of the absolutely essential foundations for a free economy are obviously stable money and a stable and sober fiscal policy, especially on the federal level. We've heard Tom, obviously, and Paul before talk about the incredible, and we can use the term of definitely unprecedented problems with the Federal Reserve and the stability of our money over the long term. Brian, you've written them very eloquently and had to speak very regularly over the recent months about the long-term problems with the United States fiscal position. Instead of asking how optimistic or pessimistic you are about those, how, on a scale of pessimism, how pessimistic would you be about our ability to deal with these problems over the next 5 to 6 years? Obviously, we will have to deal with them, but how do you think that will play out? And do you think that will be played out in a obviously productive manner in which we can actually pare these down, or do you think we'll take a crisis before something happens?
Well, thank you. Just first to put some numbers on the challenge we face. Right now, the national debt held by the public is about $25 trillion. The baseline deficit over the next 30 years, according to the Congressional Budget Office, is $114 trillion. That's the rosy scenario baseline that assumes tax cuts expire, no new spending, low interest rates, no wars, no recessions. The most optimistic is $114 trillion over 30 years. To put that in percent of GDP terms, we're going to go to 185% of GDP in debt. And to make it scary, again, this is a low interest rate scenario. Right now, the Congressional Budget Office assumes that the 10-year bond, which about matches also, the average interest rate paid on the debt goes from about 2.7 today paid on the debt to 3.2 in a decade and 4.2 over 30 years. Now, how feasible is that? Well, the 10-year bond right now is at 3.7. And the CBO is assuming that in 10 years, the interest rates will be lower than they are now, and that over 30 years, even after $100 trillion in borrowing, the interest rate's going to top out at 4.2. Now, what happens if they're wrong? Every point interest rates exceed the CBO baseline costs $30 trillion in extra interest over 3 decades. $30 trillion per point. That's roughly the cost of the Defense Department. So every time rates go up an extra point, imagine we're building a new Defense Department over 30 years. Again, to put that in percent of GDP terms, add about 40% of GDP to the debt in 30 years for each point rates rise. So what I mean is, forget 185% of GDP, we could be heading to 250, 300% of GDP. This should scare lawmakers. They don't care. They're so short-sighted right now, they're not focused on it. And you asked about how pessimistic am I? I actually think the debt limit has made me more pessimistic, because while we all agree there's only so much you can do in the debt limit, the speed with which Republicans and Democrats took Social Security and Medicare off the table was breathtaking. Republicans peeped a little bit, dipped their toe in the water a little bit in November and December. What if maybe we consider Social Security? No. President Biden, State of the Union, don't you dare. The next thing you see, Republicans running to the microphones. We love Social Security and Medicare, and we would never touch Grandma and Grandpa's benefits. This is a sacred bond, whatever. So here we are. The problem hasn't gone away. Social Security and Medicare are running a $500 billion deficit this year. A decade from now, they're going to be running a $2 trillion annual deficit. Again, 30 years from now, they're going to be running a deficit of 13% of GDP. 2 programs are going to be running a deficit of 13% of GDP. But the problem is right now that the public still believes that deficits are caused by tax cuts, waste, Ukraine spending, all of that kind of stuff. And politicians pander to this. You have Democrats who run on, we're never going to touch Social Security and Medicare. And now you have Republicans running on don't touch Social Security and Medicare. You know, we all remember Paul Ryan 10 years ago. Bless his heart, he's from Wisconsin, that's my people. But what happened was we learned over time that the Tea Party was not looking for Social Security and Medicare reform. The Tea Party was rebelling against Wall Street bailout, stimulus, and Obamacare. They held the signs, get the government out of my Medicare. And then Donald Trump ran in 2016 on saying, we're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare. And a survey by Pew showed that only 15% of Republicans want Medicare reform, and only 10% of Republicans want Social Security reform. So suddenly, Paul Ryan was a general without an army behind him. Now, the Republican Party is older, it's more populist, and they're running away from Social Security and Medicare. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little bit, getting over a cold. But the problem isn't going away, and so my pessimism is that it's going to take some degree of debt crisis in order to motivate reform. It's going to take the bond market panicking or something. Now, will the bond market be able to handle this? The final quick point I'll make is that, again, we're going to borrow $114 trillion over the next 30 years. Who's going to lend us $114 trillion? China and Japan hold $2 trillion in deficits in our debt. $2 trillion, and it's declining every month. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion. They want to unwind their balance sheet. So if China and Japan can't do it, and the Fed can't do it, you're looking at domestic investors to fund $100 trillion in borrowing over the next 30 years. If you think they can do that and are willing to do that at 3% interest rates, good luck. Because we are betting our entire fiscal future on that hope. Probably at some point, the financial markets are going to start to say, no, we can only do so much at low interest rates. Then when rates rise, we get the scenario I mentioned earlier. That's when lawmakers go and finally reform. My worry is it's going to take that.
So I'll open this question up to both of you. So obviously these two subjects are intimately related. Brian, you talked about the problem with interest rate increases and how that's going to increase our long-term fiscal deficit. Tom, you talked about how the spending is impacting obviously the inflation and all of the general problems that led to the post-2021 inflation. What do you think how is the Fed going to relate to this fiscal crisis over a long time? You mentioned the $5 trillion in Fed holdings. I remember back in the time when pre-2008 crisis, the Fed had less than $1 trillion on its balance sheet. Now we're talking about almost $9 trillion. And beyond those $5 trillion, you mentioned it. We're throwing trillions around here like, popcorn. But anyway, we keep throwing them around. There's another 3.5 or so trillion on the Fannie and Freddie debt. Mm-hmm. So we have this almost $9 trillion debt. The Fed obviously is monetizing the debt to some extent right now. How much do you think they will continue to do that? And is the crisis that Tom talked about, a financial crisis, going to be tied up in the crisis that Brian talked about, which is a fiscal crisis? And how could the Fed get out of that?
Well, let me first start by, I think there'll be increasing pressure. As Brian described it, there's going to be increasing pressure on the Fed to monetize the debt. Mm-hmm. And when it gets to the point where inflation is now out of control, that will be part of the crisis. And then the Fed will have a couple of choices. Say no, and then you'll have the banking crisis, and that'll put more pressure on them. Or say yes until we have inflationary crisis. But we are going to have, if the two parties don't get together, and politicians, as Brian said, don't stop running away from the issue, then we are going to have a huge inflationary crisis and a banking crisis and an economic crisis. Because look at what's happened already. We're talking about monetary policy and fiscal spending, but what some of the effects we've already had from the current combination of excessive spending and monetary policy is a reduction in real productivity. When we talk about wealth creation, we're talking about creating real goods, output per unit of input of real goods. The printing press does not create real wealth. It may be a lubricant to a point, but after that it becomes damaging. And I think that's what we're walking up, unless these parties get together, both, and come to a conclusion that we have to address this problem. And it can be done if they make up their mind in a bipartisan way, which they haven't done, I agree, but that's the only way to avoid crisis.
I'll add, from the fiscal dominance standpoint, imagine we get to a point in 10 or 15 years where we are having a debt crisis, or we're approaching a debt crisis. Deficits are enormous, and interest rates are starting to rise. And it's really accelerating the debt. And again, keep in mind, I mentioned each point adds $30 trillion over 30 years. If interest rates are rising and the deficits are soaring, and you're a member of Congress, I can massively increase taxes, I can drastically cut spending, both of which are going to cost me my seat, or I can make damn sure the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates low, because I can save more money by low interest rates and keeping down interest than in raising taxes or reforming entitlements. You're going to see enormous pressure from lawmakers on the Federal Reserve to maintain low interest rates purely for the purpose of avoiding a debt crisis. This is fiscal dominance. When that happens, the Federal Reserve loses its flexibility to deal with the macroeconomy. You get inflation. If the Federal Reserve says no, I would not put it past some enterprising populists, maybe a Tucker Carlson Jr. in 20 or 30 years, trying to pass legislation to constrain the Federal Reserve. Because again, if the alternative is huge tax hikes and huge spending cuts, why not just regulate the Fed? And if this sounds like a conspiracy theory, this happened in World War II. During World War II, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates low to help finance the war effort. And then after World War II ended, they couldn't extricate themselves from the policy. Lawmakers and presidents and Truman put pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low again, even after World War II ended, to keep government financing costs low. And finally, it wasn't until about 1951 that the Fed fought back and said, we are going to return to our normal macroeconomic approaches. This can happen. That's my worry. Eventually, you hamstring monetary policy because you can't afford the interest.
Well, I might just add to that, more recently than that, the Fed did monetize the pandemic debt. Mm-hmm. So it's not World War II, it's here and now, and I think that's really part of it. And remember, what you have, I say I'm not a gold bug, and that usually means you are, but the fact of the matter is, when they went off the gold standard in 1971, then monetary policy became totally discretionary, and so did fiscal policy. There was no external discipline. And so unless we bring some kind of external discipline back into this picture, then everything that we've described as crisis will, I think, emerge.
It's interesting, as you mentioned, obviously we had an explosion in inflation post-1971, and it took the Volcker shock to start to calm that down again. We had an explosion in deficits in the early 1980s, obviously, that took a lot of bipartisan agreements and eventual spending restraint in the 1990s to control that. But it does seem to me, Tom, you mentioned the sort of generational aspect of this, that you experienced some of the chaos of the 1970s. And there was something so strange about post-2008 where both the fiscal and the monetary side seemed untethered from any idea of restraint. Right. You had, in the 1970s, you didn't have a Fed balance sheet that quadrupled in 3 or 4 years. You didn't have peacetime deficits in the 1970s of 10% of GDP like you saw post-2008. Was this purely just because people did not have this experience of, say, the horrible deficits of World War II, that we had to get ourselves out of this huge debt overhang we had in the World War II? They did not have the experience of the 1970s inflation. Why did people circa 2008 think we could expand balance sheets without restraint and we could have 10+% GDP deficits without any sort of consequences long term? And again, I'm asking you the tough why or how questions, and I know those are difficult, so feel free to punt them, but there was clearly something different post-2008 that's very strange to me that I keep pondering on.
Well, I'm not sure that it's all that different. I keep telling people, when you teach economics, you put chalk or a slide, whatever it is, and the lines shift quickly. But in economics, it takes years for this to happen, because the great inflation actually started in about the middle of the 60s, and Volcker came in 1980, so a decade and a half. And over that period, you had some, you have some inflation, you raise rates, the economy would slow, well, then you'd lose nerve and you'd lower rates again, and inflation would. So you had a decade of experience. We've had about a decade and a half. And I think the next generation is about to experience the crises that an earlier generation, and it always comes as a surprise and totally unexpected and hard to explain to those in there, because they're in shock. And I think that's what's ahead. I don't think it's all that different. I mean, people did not really, even my experience was, it wasn't fully understood until I saw the banks failing one after another, and I saw the inflation rising very quickly, that you began to say, wait, I better learn from this experience. So I hate to say it, but a new generation is going to have a new experience.
Please, Brian.
I was just going to say, we also learned the wrong fiscal policy lessons from 2008. 2008, we responded to the Great Recession. We ran $1 trillion deficit, $1.4 trillion down to $1 trillion by 2012, and the world didn't end. And so the lesson people learned was maybe deficits don't matter after all. We ran a $1.4 trillion deficit, and all these Tea Party people were complaining, and the deficit solved itself and we were fine. The problem, of course, was temporary recessionary deficits when the debt is 50% of GDP aren't gonna sink you. It's the hundreds of trillions of dollars in entitlement spending long term when 74 million boomers are retiring that sink you. But people kind of got a full sense of security, and the lesson for the rest of the 2010s was deficits don't matter. Let's spend like crazy. Let's cut taxes as much as we want. Let's increase spending as much as we want. I mean, up until COVID, we still had these conversations in politics about Green New Deal, Medicare for all. We're going to do $10 trillion here, $20 trillion there, totally untethered from reality. One benefit of the inflation we're having now is it's actually kind of showing people again that this isn't free, and it's bringing people back to reality.
But remember, too, it's partly the fact of how they chose to measure inflation. Mm-hmm. They ignored asset inflation, even though the price of a housing, with pricing the younger generation out of that market, they weren't paying attention to that. So we weren't learning our lessons as they were being brought to us until price inflation finally got to 9%, and then you start paying attention, which is why we're at 5.25% interest rate right now. But we'll see what happens as we go forward from here, because we are going to continue to spend wildly, and I dearly suspect the Fed will monetize it, and we'll have the big lesson, the 30-year lesson, well, actually a 10-year lesson, because in 10 years, it's the debt to GDP, or the deficit to GDP is 7.5%. The interest on the debt will be 3.5% of GDP. That's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable, but it's only when the crisis comes that everyone says, oh, it's not sustainable. A little late.
Absolutely. Okay, so one of the things that gives me just a little bit of hope is that we did have this fiscal consolidation in the 1990s and the late 1980s, which, it was driven not by a financial crisis per se, but there were the bond vigilantes at the time. The people that were really concerned about the fiscal stability of the American government were willing to stop buying treasury bonds if they didn't get it under control. James Carville famously said, I used to think I would want to come back as a king or pope. I actually would have wished I'd come back to the bond market. But that was true only for about 2 or 3 years when he said that, when the bond market was really attentive to that. And obviously they're much less attentive to that now. It's kind of one of the big mysteries. Why do you guys think the bond market hasn't been fully attentive to that crisis yet? Is it because of the Fed monetization? And is it possibly that we'll just come to that problem when they realize it? Because as most of the students of international debt crisis says, it keeps going along all of a sudden until it can't, and then it's a sudden stop. What do you think that could look like? Or could it look like what it looked like in the 90s, that people started responding to deficits because of the interest rate increases?
I think, I would hope, I mean, it's not that that's a good strategy, but that the parties can come together and understand where this is taking us because of the CBO, because of the things you're saying. And you can find, I mean, it's not just the United States. Canada had a similar problem where you say, all right, we can't do this any longer, but here's the problem. There has to be a commitment and a trust in the institutions, which are now under question, that it's a shared sacrifice. So it's not going to be just one group who pays for it, that is big increases in taxes, but what are we going to do about entitlements, because they're not sustainable? What are we going to do about taxes? What are we going to do about subsidies? Because I tell people, I've given speeches across the country, and everyone, be a room, let's say it's a room of retirees, and I'll say we have a deficit. Oh yeah, let's get the deficit has to come down. And you say, all right, we're going to have to move the Social Security age to 70. Oh my God, you can't do that. Then you go to the ag area, and they say, all right, you got to get the debt down. And they all say, yep, we do. All right, we're going to have to cut the subsidies. Oh my God, you can't cut our subsidies. What about green? I mean, start naming them. So if you don't get everyone on the same page to say, yeah, we're all going to have to pay up on this. We're going to have to lower the entitlements program. We're going to have to lower some of the subsidies, and we're going to have to make some hard choices. Only if you can bring them on board, only if it's trusted as shared sacrifice will you make progress and avoid the deep crisis. Even there, you're going to have some adjustments to take, which will be very hard to maintain. So it's a heck of a challenge. It can be done with the right leadership, the right commitment, but that's a big order.
And, well, you know, it is one of the differences, too, between then and today. Say in 1986, when you had the Tax Reform Act, you had these problems because, there was all these infinitude of little tax expenditures that were making everything more difficult, and you could kind of wipe them out one by one with a big thing that reduced all of the rates. And back then, we were talking about a lot of different discretionary programs that we could kind of attack one-on-one. Today, Brian, as you regularly point out, the problem, say on the tax side, is not these tiny tax expenditures, these massive tax expenditures, and the problem on the spending side is overwhelmingly Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid to a lesser extent. So is this, like, in that sense, is that much less an optimistic vision than it was in the early 1990s when we were talking about controlling a discretionary budget where lots of little interest groups that Tom pointed to can complain, but you didn't have these two overwhelming programs kind of that you had to take on and not being able to ignore that to the ignorance of everything else?
Absolutely. I wrote a report at Manhattan Institute that you can find on 2019 on the history of budget negotiations and budget deals since 1983. In this report, I examined 14 case studies, the 14 main deficit negotiations in Congress since 1983, 6 of which were successful and 8 of which were unsuccessful. The first thing I noticed is that if you look at the 6 successful budget deals since 1983, 53% of all savings in these deals came from discretionary spending. Even though generally mandatory drives the deficit, the savings come from discretionary. Well, we've gotten to a certain point now where discretionary is about 6.5% of GDP. Back then it was about 9%. You really probably can't get discretionary below about 6% of GDP. That was the advantage we had back then. There was a lot to be taken out of discretionary spending. In fact, in the 90s, most of the savings were simply defense drawdown after the Cold War. That's how we were able to meet the spending caps of the 90s. We were able to do it discretionary. Well, now it's Social Security and Medicare, and there's really no way around it, and that makes it much more complicated. The same report determined that in virtually every one of the 14 negotiations, whether or not there was a successful deal hinged on 3 variables. And you had to get 2 out of the 3 to get a deal. You had to have a penalty default, something like a debt limit, a fiscal cliff, something that's going to go wrong if you don't have a deal, public support, and healthy negotiations in Congress. If you got 2 out of the 3, there was a deal every time. if you didn't get 2 out of the 3, they failed every time except one, and that was the 1993 Clinton tax hike, where they just used a full Democratic trifecta to muscle it through. But what you need is a cliff, public support, and healthy negotiations. And of those 3 variables, healthy negotiations has actually become the hardest one. Congress doesn't even know how to negotiate. They don't know how to work together. They don't know how to sit down. It's remarkable reading the case studies of congressional anti-deficit negotiations in the 80s and 90s, how constructive and respectful they were, even among people we remember hating each other. It's so hard to recreate that today. Those are the 3 variables you need, and it's really hard.
I think we have time for maybe one question. Is that right? Maybe 2. Anybody want to raise their hand? I can always trust on you. Oh, I have to go with my boss first. Is that okay? Yeah.
Brian, you've talked about the resistance to Medicare reform, but one thing that's very striking to me, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, a large amount of the revenue to pay for it is coming out of projected future Medicare spending. And my understanding is that on many, many occasions, Democrats and Republicans have sought to trim future growth of Medicare spending over time. So why is it that congressional Democrats were able to use future Medicare savings in order to finance various green energy tax credits, yet it's somehow anathema for conservatives to say, hey, we want to ensure that we don't have to increase middle-class taxes in the future, therefore we want to also trim future growth in Medicare spending?
Yeah, I mean, our colleague Chris Pope has written on this, that some of the biggest reductions in Medicare payments to providers have been enacted by Democrats. That's what paid for Obamacare. $700 billion out of Obamacare was paid for by cutting Medicare providers. Now, granted, Republicans get a little nervous about trying to do too much out of Medicare providers because conservatives believe that you could only cut payment rates so much. But it is interesting that Democrats are willing to revisit the piggy bank that is Medicare to pay for Obamacare, to pay for green subsidies, to pay for Medicare for All's enormous promise of fairy tale benefits, but that when conservatives try to go to healthcare reform, it's you're starving grandma. Well, ultimately, as Chris has written, and as we know, Democrats have no problem doing it for those rating healthcare for those policies. It's just, this is why we just need to get both parties, we have to find a way to get both parties to sit down at the table on this stuff, because I think there is a path forward on healthcare reform. There is a way to thread the needle on these policies, but they have to stop demagoguing each other first.
And then I think we get the mic over there. You can start talking, I guess, right? You're pretty loud too, Ken, right?
First off, directly to Reihan, there are many smart people in this city who work on budget, tax, fiscal policies, and the 2 who I pay the most attention to, one of them is Brian. So I just need to compliment the clarity. You don't wear a red shirt or a blue shirt. You describe what is happening and what the field of options are, and it's tremendously valuable for those of us who don't spend day after day in fiscal policy.
I appreciate that.
I want to pick up on something that I heard Reihan say right at the top at 1 or 2 o'clock this afternoon. It was about growth rates, and here we're talking about economic growth in the economy. You gave us a couple rules of thumb about interest rates go up. This is what it means for how much we have to pay in the future because of our current debt obligations. My intuition is that we cannot grow our way out of the long-term fiscal problems that we have. But if growth goes from this sort of anemic 2.2, 2.3% that we've been seeing for the last 15 years, up a point, if we can hold the trajectory at 3 or 3.5%, what does that mean for what you told us about the long-term trends?
So on the first order basis, if we could even just get productivity, the challenge, of course, with getting a lot of economic growth is that a lot of the growth we used to have was driven by demographics, labor supply, and we now have labor supply slowing down. And so we need to get growth now out of productivity and capital investment, which is a little harder. On a first order effect, if we could even increase productivity rates by 0.6 to 0.8% per year, which is a huge increase, The first order effect would be to eliminate about 1/3 of the long-term shortfall, according to my modeling, which could be right or wrong. I don't know. I can't speak to others. The first order effect would be it would wipe out about 1/3 of the long-term shortfall. But the issue with that first order effect is that it doesn't take into account that if productivity rises, interest rates will probably rise too, which will automatically give back some of the savings. Also, wages will go up, which will in turn increase Social Security costs. And also, when the economy grows faster, people consume more health care. So that you still get benefits, but even that 1/3 you eliminate, even if we could have this huge productivity surge, you start to even give back some of that in Social Security, health care, and interest costs. I tell people that growth is necessary but not sufficient. It's almost impossible to solve the long-term budget in a sluggish economy. But even faster growth doesn't fully solve the problem either, because you just can't grow enough to pay for Social Security and Medicare costs growing 7% a year. And even if you were growing faster, like I said, you might actually push the costs higher.
The other thing you need to remember is the fact that you are monetizing the debt and undermining the economy means your economy is becoming less efficient rather than more efficient, and that actually makes growth even harder to achieve, higher growth. And that's what's been going on. During the teens, productivity actually, between 2010 and 2018, productivity was actually declining, even though we were pumping this money in, partly because of the great inefficiencies from zero interest rates. So it's its own worst enemy that way.
Well, can you please join me in thanking our two panelists, Tom Hoenig and Brian Riedl?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for being part of Unleashing Prosperity, the first of what I hope will be many MI conversations on America's economic future here in DC. We've heard from esteemed speakers who have shed light on the obstacles to a new supply-side agenda, and more importantly, what it will take to overcome them. I'd like to thank our speakers, partners, and the dedicated team at the Manhattan Institute for making this event a success, in particular Michelle Jacob, Pat Burke, Eli Hickson, and everyone else who's gathered here today. Thank you very much.